All right, let's kick things off. Thank you all for coming. My name's Logan. I am the founder and CEO of Aerotas, and today we're going to be talking about profiting from drone surveying. So you guys are going to be with me the next, 3.5 hours. We got a break in the middle or so, and we actually have plenty of content to cover in that whole time as we talk about drone surveying. And what we're going to cover today is actually the whole drone surveying workflow. So that means we're going to cover all the way from the beginning, things like hardware selection, through mission planning, how do you actually plan a flight path, setting ground control points, field operations, and all that into the office workflow as well. The photogrammetry steps, RTK processing, as that's a new and bigger part of drone surveying, measuring accuracy, reporting accuracy, drafting line work, finishing it in CAD, and then creating that all into a complete workflow. And that probably sounds like a lot, and honestly it is, but that's why we're here to talk about it today. So just for my edification, a brief show of hands, how many people own a drone of some sort or are flying a drone of some sort? Okay, great. And how many people are using it to actually get topo data on some of their projects? All right, good. So we'll cover a lot of that, but really the big point of this is to teach you how to get that data regularly, consistently, in a way that makes business sense too, so profitably. That's going to be a big part of the focus of what we're talking about here. So just a little bit of introduction about Aerotas as a company. We turn drone photos into survey data, so we work with clients all across the country, including a handful of people in this conference today, and we turn those drone photos into actual survey grade data. So we offer photogrammetry and CAD drafting line work services to land surveyors. But enough about us. I'll give us a plug for our projects at the end of the course, but let's actually dive right into it. So first off, what's the end goal? Why are we talking about drone surveying? Why is drone surveying such a big buzzword in the industry? Well, first of all, the end goal is going to be better deliverables, better than what you can give with just traditional land-based surveying. That means instead of just, basic points or contours, you're also going to enrich that data with a lot of imagery. You're going to have the ability to go back, pull extra points, things like that. You also want to save time. You can do, if you have 20 acres of topo or something, you can fly a drone and cover that whole area in 15 minutes or something. So you can save a whole bunch of time with this technology as well. But also, you want to save money on this too, right? If you wind up being able to get a really great aerial survey, but you're spending $30,000 just on the labor that it takes to get a drone flying, then that's probably not that good as well. But really, when we talk about the end goal, this is the type of thing that we care about, right? It's a survey. It's nothing special. There's really no indication that this was done by drone at all. And in fact, it wasn't all done by drone. It was done by a mixed workflow. We'll cover the parts that can be done in the field and the parts that should be done in the office a little bit later on. But the fact is, this is what your final deliverable should look like. Typical survey, plus maybe some up-to-date imagery. Did it come from a satellite, drone? I don't know. Really what matters is that it's the right information for the client in a fast and affordable way. So as we talk about this, the title of this talk is Profiting from Drone Surveying. One of the themes that I'm going to hammer on again and again, and I'll be probably a little bit of a broken record on this, is if your drone program isn't saving time and money, then it isn't working, right? If it's not saving you time and money, then it's not a drone program, it's a science fair project. It's an experiment. It may be cool, but the goal is actually to have this be a tool that works for you guys. And so that's what we're going to teach you today, is how to actually get from the drone as a science fair project or something that is cool to actually having it work for you as a tool and get you good data time and time again. And one of the bad parts about that, kind of a little bit of a bummer, is it takes the drone from being a really cool, awesome thing, makes it really boring. And that's what it should be, right? It's a boring tool. You push a button, it buzzes around, and then you actually get your data. So we'll take something really, really cool and make it suck for you. You're welcome. So here's what when we talk about that kind of whole workflow, profiting from drone surveying, how do you get from flying a drone to your final survey? These are the 6 broad steps that we like to think about. So it starts with every project, from planning a project, setting your ground targets, doing your field work and your actual ground surveying on the ground. It's another thing that I'll talk about regularly today is the drone is not some magic bullet that will replace surveyors and be afraid because drones are going to make surveying obsolete, not even close to it. Until a drone can hammer in a stake or pull out a shovel and a metal detector, it's very far from replacing land surveyors. So there's plenty of work to do on the ground. Then you need to actually collect your data. But the second half, this is where a lot of people obviously stumble too. Partly because there's a lot of promises in the software world of these magical push button, throw data at it and ta-da, it's done. But really there's a lot of steps in the data processing side as well. Photogrammetry, stitching photos into a 3D model, drafting line work, going from your 3D model into your actual clean CAD data, and then finishing in CAD, which is merging your drone data with your field data, putting your seal on it, making it actually be a good final deliverable. So like I said, 2 general steps. We're going to cover all of the field data collection stuff before the break, and then after the break, we'll dive right into the office data collection part. Now we've been doing this, helping surveyors use drones since about 2014, which makes us pretty new to the surveying world, but among the older companies in the drone world, actually. But we've seen a pretty consistent journey from almost everyone that starts out this program. And from that show of hands that I did in the beginning of the room, I know there are different people that are at different steps along this journey. But typically the first thing that we see is taking basic photos and videos. Actually, I should go back. The first thing that we see is buying a drone to piss off your cat, or maybe as a toy for one of your kids or cousins, but I'm not going to count that. First step is just taking basic photos and videos. You buy a drone, say, hey, let's take some photos of a job site, monitor the condition, keep a good record of what a job site is like. Pretty simple, not too technologically complex nowadays with the drone hardware that's out there. Next step is actually getting to ortho photos. Taking those pictures, throwing them at either a program like Pix4D or Drone Deploy or something that can take them, stitch them together into a nice ortho-rectified map. Pretty cool. Next step after that is actually getting high accuracy and high precision ortho photos. That's the next step that starts to get a little bit tricky. Then you need to start learning things about ground control points, measuring accuracy, using checkpoints, verifying that the actual ortho photo, the data that comes out of the software systems, is actually going to be accurate. Next step after that, moving from your 2D ortho photos into your actual 3D data. Digital surface models and point clouds, a lot more rich data, still very noisy, working with these really big, huge, cumbersome files, but it's really, really valuable, high-quality data. Next step is going from those huge, really dense, really rich files down into clean CAD drawings. Ones that, instead of being 10 gigabyte point clouds, are actually just the points and polylines that you care about, that are actually coded, that you can import into CAD and use properly. Then finally, going to final survey deliverables too. That means merging with all of your field data, adding in culture, adding in right-of-ways and utilities and things that you can't pull in from the drone. And then the last step is actually integrating that all into a workflow. And when we say that, that means it's, okay, you can get to final survey deliverables, but not just once, and not in a way that it takes you 30 hours per project to do it, but in a way that it can be repeatable, that you can do it project after project after project, and still get that good data, and still save time and money. Again, save time and money and not do it in a way that kills you. That's how this becomes a repeatable, viable program and a repeatable, useful tool for you guys. So as I start diving into some of the other things, I should point out, please feel free to raise your hand at any point and ask questions. I like questions, so you can just interrupt me and I'll be more than happy to help, as I know we're going to be covering some technical topics as well, and some interesting stuff that's in the news too, and I want to make sure I answer all your questions. So let's start with hardware. That's the first step of the journey, right? Is actually picking a drone. What we usually say is, buy based on what matters, not based on what's exciting. So what do we mean by that? I mean, it means, first you need to have your accuracy in there, which is going to be more than just buying the most expensive drone, because accuracy comes from all of these different factors. So when we talk about accuracy, it's accuracy, acreage, how much ground can you cover per hour at the accuracy you need, making sure that the drone is reliable, and reliable means more than just when you fly it, it doesn't drop out of the air. Reliable means that when you go and push take off, that it actually works. There are a lot of insanely complicated drone systems out there that we don't particularly like, not because they get bad data, but because there's just so many little software glitches that often they fail to do exactly what you want them to do the first time, and you lose a bunch of time in the field. And then all-in cost too, so that matters when we talk about profiting from this. If you buy a $100,000 drone, the ROI math is going to be a heck of a lot harder for your company than if you can get the same data from a $1,500 drone. So let's actually put this into some of the different options here. Let's start with sensors. Because this is, especially with people that have experience in traditional photogrammetry, this is one of the first things that people think about when buying a drone or trying to pick hardware. Okay, what sensor is the drone carrying? What sort of payload is actually going to be on there? Broadly speaking, there are about 3 different types of cameras out there. The first is an integrated drone-specific camera, like the DJI Phantom 4, which is super popular, the Inspire M200 series as well. You can usually get, with a good workflow, you can get about 1/10 of a foot accuracy. We'll talk more what we mean about accuracy in a second. The next option are larger format independent cameras, like a Sony A7R. These can range anywhere from 25 megapixels up to 50 or 80 megapixels in some really high-end cases. A lot more complicated systems, honestly, to get them all to work. When you're looking at the all-in price, those are about 20 grand. And then there's LiDAR too. Aerial LiDAR is something that is a really, really hot topic right now because the quality of the data is killer, and especially up here, it's great because it can actually at least somewhat penetrate through vegetation and tree cover, but it's very, very expensive. You're looking at about $200,000 all in, and it's a pretty cutting-edge technology still. Right now, honestly, we're waiting on LiDAR. It's not quite good enough. It's definitely where things are going in the future. And like I said, the quality of the data is there, but it's a really, really complicated and expensive system. The ground cover penetration isn't perfect when it's a drone-mounted LiDAR system as compared to something like a manned aircraft mounted LiDAR system. It's much smaller, much lower power lasers. Your flight times are going to be really low. Your range isn't going to be that great, and once you take into account all of the various various factors that can impact accuracy, like vibration, a low quality IMU, just general noise in some of your GPS processing, you're actually only getting about 2 to 3/10 accuracy on a drone-mounted LiDAR system. Now, it doesn't mean the laser doesn't have 2 to 3/10 accuracy. The laser itself, as you guys are used to using laser technology, is pretty much perfectly accurate. It's all those other sources of noise in a drone-mounted LiDAR system that makes it 2 to 3/10 of a foot. And like I said, it's very expensive, starting at around 150 grand up to maybe $500,000 all in. Yeah?
You said that it's 2 to 3/10 accuracy on the drone mounted. Do you know what the accuracy is when it's a manned aircraft?
It can be as good as about 1/10 of a foot, typically. It depends on other factors like flight altitude as well. So we've seen there's some counties that will survey an entire county with aerial LiDAR, but if they do it from 10,000 feet and get 1 point for every 25 square meters or something, then maybe it's good enough for half-foot contours and not much beyond that. So it's probably as good as about 1/10 of a foot. But those are really just a different class of systems too. I know that the actual hardware cost of LiDAR that's on manned aircraft is usually north of $1 million. But they can make up for it because they'll keep those things flying all over the country all the time, and they charge a lot of money for those big projects. So LiDAR is something that we're looking at, and honestly, we think this is where the future is going to go. There are a few technologies being researched in the automotive industry right now for self-driving cars that could make their way into the survey field as well that could really, really bring down the cost of these things. So we're keeping an eye on that. We're excited about that, but it's just not quite there yet. So for us, when we talk about drone survey programs, photogrammetry is really the way to go. Photogrammetry is especially the way to go when you want to make money with it. So then, after the sensor, there's also the airframe options as well. As with the sensor, there are kind of 3 major options that we see for airframes. Small multirotors, like the DJI Phantom 4 Pro, that's the most popular drone surveying tool out there. Large multirotors, the DJI M600, there's some micro drones ones out there as well. And then fixed wing and or VTOL vertical takeoff and landing ones. They fly like airplanes and are typically more lightweight but a little bit more complicated to use. So let's talk about the benefits of these different things. First of all, again, as I always talk about ROI, is the cost. When you start with a small multi-rotor, about $10,000 all in. And I'm talking all-in price with everything, including actually training your people on it, all of your various accessories and whatnot. Honestly, you can buy a Phantom 4 on Amazon for $1,500 or something. But being able to use it properly requires a lot more equipment.
Is that processing software as well? I mean, what's that?
This does not include processing software. Processing, we'll talk about that after the break. There are a lot of different options for processing with, as you might imagine, different price points on that as well. So this is what we say. This will include like training, extra batteries, cases, your iPad, the autopilot software, FAA registry, a lot of the just like little stuff that adds up. We're being a little conservative. Honestly, if you really wanted to go budget, you could definitely get cheaper than that. Large multi-rotors, you're looking about 20 grand all in. They're a lot heavier, a lot more complicated. I would never say that they gather bad data because often their data is going to be better than these ones, but they're much more expensive, but more importantly, they're much more complicated. Like I mentioned before, those complicated ones, they just have a high ratio of just not quite working. You know, when you turn something on and you just get an error. And it's not that it's broken, it's like, all right, well, I gotta troubleshoot it, I gotta restart this. Oh, I forgot to plug this wire in. It looks like this battery wasn't all the way inserted. It's just complicated. There are a lot of little things that could go wrong that lead you to not getting the right data the first time. And that really matters. I mean, the biggest time killer in drone surveying, heck, I'd say surveying altogether, is having to revisit a project site. That's a time killer. And if you have to revisit a project site because your drone is so complicated that it didn't just work the first time, that you can't just pull it out, put it on the ground, and hit go, that's a big problem. So that's the biggest downside of those complicated ones. And then there are these fixed wing ones. They're a lot more expensive, typically $30,000, just because they're a lot more specialized. SenseFly EV is the most common one and probably the market leader of these fixed wing drones. They have the benefit that they can cover a heck of a lot more land with a single battery, just because aerodynamically they're much more efficient. But the downside is, because they're plane style, they have to fly high and fast. These other guys can fly low and slow, which means that they don't typically have as good accuracy as the multirotors. Because multirotors can fly at 100 feet and crawl at 2 miles an hour if you want to get really, really, really high accuracy data. Those fixed wings, they're good enough for 1-foot contours for basic topo mapping, but they're not going to get you that 1/10 of a foot or better accuracy on hardscape that some of the multirotors can. And then the next thing on hardware that I want to talk about is onboard RTK and PPK options. This is probably the latest one that has come out in just the last 6 months or so. Onboard RTK and onboard dual band GPS receivers are finally hitting a point where they're actually cheap enough and easy enough to use that it kind of crosses that threshold from being a science fair project to actually a useful tool. But the different options out here is, with a lot of the older drones, and honestly your base level Phantom 4s where you're talking just a couple grand for the drone, no RTK or PPK, you're using ground control points to actually anchor the project, to reference the project, and all of your accuracy is coming from those ground control points. It has the benefits of being incredibly cheap, incredibly simple, very reliable, but the downside is it takes more time in the field because you actually have to set ground control points, more ground control points. RTK and PPK, you perform those corrections on the drone itself. You get a lot higher accuracy of where the drone is, but it's going to be a lot more expensive and a more complicated workflow. And then between RTK and PPK, RTK of course being real-time GPS processing, PPK being post-processed. Really, with drone photogrammetry, we're big fans of PPK, of post-processing, because you have to bring all the data into the office anyway to process it in photogrammetry and like Pix4D. So you don't really benefit from that real-time data. And in fact, having a post-processing workflow is more reliable because you can use different base stations, you can use CORS base stations. We'll dive into that a little bit more after the break as well. But all of those are kind of your main options. So knowing what sensor you need to get, knowing what airframe you're going to get, knowing what GPS add-ons you're going to get, all of that kind of combines into helping you pick what the right aircraft is for you. What our recommendation is for surveyors, and you don't have to take this because honestly all of them will work, but this is just from our experience. Our recommendation for surveyors is one of the newest ones. It's called the DJI Phantom 4 RTK. It's a good balance of all of these things. It starts at around $6,000 or $8,000 for the aircraft and goes up from there. So there are definitely cheaper options out there, but it's reliable. You can get your 1/10 of a foot accuracy, and it's not the right tool for absolutely everyone. Some people it does make sense to go for the cheaper ones and go with ground control point workflows. Some people it makes sense to go for fixed wings because they're covering huge amounts of land. But this is a really good versatile tool, we think, plus all of the other stuff that we say goes with it. Here, this one shows you obviously extra batteries, a case, iPad, checklists, blah, blah, blah. There's all kinds of stuff on there. So, any questions on drone hardware? All right. Oh, yeah.
How long what's the flight time with the one set of batteries in that particular drone?
Great question. I'm going to rephrase the question. What you care about isn't really how many minutes it stays in the air. What you really care about is how many acres you can cover with a single battery.
Oh yeah, good point.
And how long it'll take to cover that much area.
Yes.
Because honestly, if I said 5 hours and then you have to sit in the field for 5 hours, that kind of sucks, doesn't it?
Yeah, a little bit.
So yeah, we regularly hear that. What's the flight time? But it's a little bit of a misnomer. I mean, if you're in film editing, sure, flight time matters. Because to answer your original question, it's about real world conditions, 20 minutes or so per battery. But when we talk about acreage, if you're just doing topo, you fly at a higher altitude and you can cover about 60 or 70 acres in each 20-minute battery is your land coverage. If you were doing super accurate, low altitude, like hardscape, for example, if you were doing an as-built and it's mostly hardscape and you need it to be really good, then you can cover about maybe 8 to 10 acres per 20-minute battery, approximately. Those are ballparks, but that's really the number that you really should be looking at is how many acres can I cover and what accuracy am I going to get?
Sure. Yep. Makes sense.
So yeah, with 4 batteries and you're just doing topo, you can easily cover about 250 acres in just a couple of hours of field time.
All right.
Is the PPK RTK included in the Phantom 4, or is that an add-on product?
So they've got 2 versions now. They have the Phantom 4 Pro and the Phantom 4 RTK. So the Phantom 4 Pro, the aircraft starts at about $1,500. The Phantom 4 RTK starts at about $7,500, but they're pretty opaque with their pricing, honestly, and different suppliers have different deals and different packages and whatnot. So I can't tell you.
Does the PPK or not?
Oh, it's called the Phantom 4 RTK, and all that means is it has that dual band antenna on top of it, and it is capable of both RTK and PPK workflows. But it's the antenna that makes a difference, that it has that high precision antenna on top of it.
Does that affect the battery time a lot? Is it a lot heavier?
Negligibly.
Okay.
Uses a little bit more power, makes it a teeny bit less aerodynamic, but we're talking, I mean, maybe 15 seconds of less battery time, really not a huge difference there.
Can you upgrade Pro to the RTK?
Nope. It's DJI, it's kind of like, they want to be like Apple. They want to make sure that you throw it away and buy a brand new one every year if you can. Honestly, I compare these things a lot like cell phones, and if you think of it that way, you'll be pretty happy. If you want, you can buy one, and you can keep it for 4 years, and it'll work. It'll do the same thing 4 years from now that it does today. But there will be one that comes out next year that's a little bit better, a little bit faster, a little bit better camera, a little bit better battery life. After 2 years, the batteries start to show their age, and maybe you should think about replacing it. After 4 years, if you've held on to it, that's kind of impressive, but you can definitely make it stretch. It's kind of the same life cycle there, as with a lot of consumer electronics these days. All right, so next up, let's dive into mission planning. So you've got your drone. We're going to play with that, or we're going to pretend a lot of this is with the DJI Phantom 4 Pro. Then we'll call it the non-RTK version, just because that's far and away the most common surveying drone out there, and it's very effective and really good at what it does. So what is mission planning? When I talk about mission planning, what do I actually mean? It's questions like, is this actually a good site for drone photogrammetry? Is it legal to fly here? What altitude should I fly at? What's the appropriate overlap? How many ground control points should I set? All of these things that you need to kind of ask yourself, and once you're experienced with flying a drone, these questions come really, really easy, but the whole basic concept of mission planning is knowing when to use the drone and how to use the drone in the right way. So, why care about mission planning? Well, the first thing is to save field time, right? Save time and money. That's the whole point of what I'm doing here. Good mission planning means fewer ground control points, which is less time in the field, less ground surveying altogether, shorter flight times, which means that, you know, if you're using one 20-minute battery instead of 4 20-minute batteries, that's a good thing, saving more time there. And no field revisits, getting the right data the first time, every time. And also save office time. Good mission planning on the beginning stages of a drone program will save you a ton of time and headache in the office side of things as well. And whether you're the same person that does both field work and office work or different, I mean, if you do all the flying and then hand the data to someone else, this is how to keep them from wanting to stab you in your sleep because you gave them bad data, and it's going to take them days to make up for it. So save office time by making sure that good decisions in the field will lead to short, quick processing times, better accuracy, fewer errors, and an overall simpler workflow. And all of that starts with the actual mission planning side. So let's talk about flight plan best practices. So here are 3 best practices that we talk about when flying a drone surveying mission. Lawnmower flight path, which is like you would see something over here. It just goes back and forth, and each one of these little breadcrumbs is a photo. That is specifically in opposition to things like crosshatch flight patterns, which you do that, maybe east and west, and then fly another pattern north and south. Now, why do I say only do it once and not twice? Isn't more data a good thing? Well, not always, because it leads to a lot more time in the field, a lot more processing time, and doesn't actually give you better accuracy. Same thing with overlap. 75-75 overlap is a real Goldilocks number there. That means that each photo and the photo next to it, there's 75% commonality in those 2 photos. You do the math on that, that means any single point on the ground can actually be seen by 16 individual photos with that overlap. And lastly is nadir only, which means the camera's pointing straight down, no obliques, don't actually tilt the camera, that can actually introduce error. Now we get some pushback on this a lot of time. Isn't it better? Like I've heard recommendations from some of these software processors. More overlap, 80-80 overlap, crosshatch flight pattern, better for 3D, do it at a 20-degree oblique tilt. And that's because they want to give you more data, but honestly, there is such a thing as too much data. When you have all of this extra data, I mean, these companies that say gather extra data for better accuracy, they assume that processing is free. It isn't. They assume that time is free. It isn't. They assume that your computers are free. They're not. And that everything that you do can handle a 50 gigabyte file just as well as it can handle a 10 gigabyte file, which is also not the case. So all this whole just gather tons and tons of extra data is just, it's totally garbage in the real world because it just winds up taking so much extra time. Gathering twice as much data will take twice as much time in the field. It will actually lead to longer processing times, sometimes not twice as much, because photogrammetry is a nonlinear process. You double the amount of data, you sometimes will 4x the amount of processing time that you have. Larger, more cumbersome files, so that your computers get bogged down, your network gets bogged down, that's always a lot harder. And even possible erroneous matches. You get too much data, you even can lower your accuracy. That's possible as well. So the solutions, fly higher where you can. Seems counterintuitive, right? Fly higher for better accuracy, but that's actually a really good way to do it. It saves you a lot of processing time and makes your program a lot more efficient. Single lawnmower, not crosshatch, and no overlap overkill. Don't try and do 95-95 overlap or something. It'll take way too much time in the field. In fact, it's something that we hear kind of a frustratingly frequent amount is, oh yeah, I flew it at 90% overlap because I just wanted to see if it was any better. Well, that's not really how it works. First of all, it's going to take so long to process this stuff, and you're not going to actually see any better improvement here. It's going to look exactly the same. So those are just some of our recommendations for keeping a good, clean, efficient workflow. And those are also the decisions that you make on the front end, on the mission planning side, that will pay off hugely later down in the workflow side.
On that previous slide, what program did you use to do the lawnmower?
Oh, this was with a program called Map Pilot. It's an iOS app. It's like
have a lot of suggestions, or I'm sure there's more than one.
there are dozens of autopilot apps out there. Honestly, there's no one perfect one. We use Map Pilot Map Pilot. It's $10. We think it's pretty darn good. There are a bunch of other ones out there. Drone Deploy makes a free one on iOS and Android that's not bad. DJI has some of their own. Honestly, they all have different features that make them kind of nice for different specific projects. But really anything that gets the drone up and flying safely and reliably is fine by us. Yeah. So yeah, there is such a thing as too much data. Absolutely. The fact that like always getting more data is a good thing, false. Completely false when you actually have business to run. So let's actually dive into some examples of mission planning and show you some of the common errors that we see as well in mission planning. So this is an actual project that we saw showing these red dots are going to be some of the photos, these blue dots are going to be some of the ground control points that are out here. And it's an example of areas where there's just insufficient overlap. Remember we said 75, 75? These ones have some serious gaps here where it's just that single flight line of photos. When you try and stitch all that together in a map, there's really just not enough data there to actually put it all together and keep it in a reliably accurate way. So this is just an example of where insufficient overlap can wind up leading to low accuracy projects. If we were to plan the mission for something like this, you want to make sure that you have enough overlap there. And also over here, you can see there are like 4 or 5 or 6 different flight patterns all intersecting. That's going to be too much data in those areas. So we kind of have this mix of some areas that have not enough to even get good accuracy, and some areas that have so much data that it's going to take a long time to process, and you really get the worst of both worlds. And this is something that is fairly frequent among novice pilots too, that are just like, yeah, we'll plug in a map or draw some boundaries on a map on our tablet and hope that it gathers the data that we need. And that's really not what you need to do. You can't just hope that it gathers the data you need. You need to know what you're actually looking for here. Another common thing that people ask about with mission planning is how to deal with high relief projects as well. So there's some, so what we're looking at here, this is a point cloud view from the profile. So we've got a hill that we're looking at from the side. All of those green dots on the top are going to be the individual photos, and these things right here are going to be some of our ground control points. So how do you deal with high relief projects as far as mission planning goes? Well, you have a couple of ways to deal with it. First of all, there are some apps, autopilot apps out there that have features called terrain tracking, which can accurately kind of manage the terrain so that it always stays a fixed amount above the terrain. Those are useful, but they're not available in every project. Some sites you don't have the right altitude or the right information, and excuse me, not all apps and drones are capable of that sort of thing. So what we see in a project like this is where the drone flew at a fixed altitude, and obviously it was, call that 150 feet above the ground over here on the right, and maybe 300 or 400 feet above the ground on the left. So what that means in terms of accuracy is that the accuracy is actually going to be a lot better on the right-hand side than it is going to be on the left. Because the closer the drone is to the ground, it's going to get higher resolution photos, and if you have enough ground control points, you're actually going to wind up getting better data. And on the left, it actually still works, but you're going to get a little bit lower data. In fact, we can see some extra noise in the point cloud here. That's probably from just being further away from the ground. There's also going to be some vegetation there, I'd imagine. But one of the other options when mission planning with these high relief areas is to run it in tiers too. If we had taken that whole flight right here, this kind of second flight, and dropped it down by about 50 or 100 feet, that actually would have worked as well. And you can still stitch everything together, having it in kind of multiple tiers when flying to make sure that you get approximately the same level of accuracy and resolution at each one of the altitudes that you're flying.
Do you have to program that into your flight plan that you're changing your measure up essentially?
Sometimes. So the way that most of these flight plans actually work in most of the autopilot apps is when you type in a flight altitude, it's an altitude above the starting point. So if I were to stand right here and say, set it to 200 feet, it'll go up to there. And if I were to stand here and say fly at 200 feet, it would only go about halfway up.
Okay.
So it's above the takeoff point is typically where you set those altitudes. So that's something that the way that I would probably approach a project like this is I would keep the autopilot set at an altitude of 200 feet, and I would launch it from 2 separate areas. The higher area I would launch from the top, from the upper area. The lower area, if possible, I would launch from right around there.
about that terrain tracking thing. Do you use that yourself?
Yeah,
And so how does it work really well?
it works okay. Terrain tracking features for a lot of drones, the biggest thing is they need to have a model of the ground that they're actually tracking, right? And what they'll use is something called SRTM. It was a 2003 NASA model of the United States. And so it's often very outdated because it's all data from 2003. So if you're working on any project site where the terrain has changed since 2003, totally no longer possible to even use it. It becomes a huge safety risk at that point. If it hasn't really changed significantly since 2003, then you can use that, but it's still fairly low resolution. I think it's like 1 elevation point per 30 meters or something.
So how does that work with the RTK? Does it use that at all in its terrain tracking? Do you know?
We're conflating a couple of things. So when you're using an RTK aircraft, typically it's just passively recording all of the dual band stuff. It's not actually using the RTK for active navigation systems. It's still using as, and I'm getting a little technical here, and so I'm happy to talk about this afterwards, but the primary navigation tool for altitude in these things is actually going to be the barometer, a pressure sensor. And that's why it's all relative to the takeoff location. All right, so a couple of other things in mission planning as well is features can split projects in photogrammetry, such as this one. So we'll dive into ground control points and ground control point setup next, but being able to manage a site like this looks pretty normal, fairly straightforward rectangle. 5 ground control points is what we'd probably set, but there's one big issue here. And that issue is that we've got a big body of water running through it right here. Now water is impossible to reconstruct in photogrammetry because every little ripple on the water, every little ripple is going to change every time you take a photo, so it just becomes a black void. So what this winds up actually doing is that splits this into 2 projects. As far as I'm concerned, when this project is flown, even if you did it in a single flight, this would count as 2 projects, which means that you need to have a couple more ground control points on either side of the river to make sure that you actually have enough data. Like I said, the next thing that we're going to talk about is the number of ground control points that you actually need to get good accuracy. But these are just some of the different considerations in mission planning that you need to look at to make sure that you have all the right data and that you get it right the first time. All right. So, to keep moving forward, setting ground control points and checkpoints. Now, just to make sure we're all on the same page of what ground control points and checkpoints are. Ground control points, for those that aren't familiar, are points that you actually survey and mark clearly in 3 dimensions on the ground, typically with some sort of cross or just any sort of point that is used to actually directly anchor the model, the 3D model that you create with the drone to everything else that you're doing. Think of it like, localizing your project so that your aerial data matches your ground data absolutely perfectly. And part of the reason we need this is because photogrammetry, the way that I like to think of it is that photogrammetry creates a 3D model that's kind of like a rubber sheet. That if you don't anchor it down, it's really flexible, it can move around. In fact, if you don't use ground control points at all, the only accuracy that you have is the consumer grade GPS on the drone, which is about as accurate as the blue dot on your phone. It could be off easily by 5-10 feet in the horizontal and as much as 50 or 100 feet vertical. I mean, it's just not even close to survey grade accurate. So you take this rubber sheet and you need ground control points to really nail it down. But like a rubber sheet, if you don't use enough nails, it's going to have areas where it can still kind of flap around in the wind and stuff like that. So let's talk about accuracy expectations and ground control points. So accuracy is most predominantly impacted by the altitude that you fly. So we have a chart here. Now this chart here is based off of the Phantom 4 Pro, like I was talking about earlier. Every drone and every camera that you use will have a slightly different set of numbers for this sort of thing, but this is from our experience. And what you can see is that at 100-foot flight altitude, that's 100 feet above the ground, you can cover about 5 acres per 17 minutes, and you're going to get 1/10 of a foot or better than 1/10 of a foot accuracy. On the flip side of that, when you're flying at 400 feet, which is the legal maximum that you can actually fly at, you can cover about 50 acres per battery and get 0.4 of a foot vertical and 0.3 horizontal. Typically, what we see with these sorts of projects is that 200 feet is going to be kind of the good middle ground, 20 acres per battery, 2 foot vertical, 1,500 horizontal, something like that. Now, what these are going to be good for, or, well, what I would say is know what you need for the project before you actually go out and fly. If you are doing a project site where all you need is topo and all you need is 1 foot contours, you should probably be flying at 400 feet because you can cover a lot more ground and it still has plenty of accuracy for 1 foot contours. If you are doing an as-built of a project site with a lot of hardscape, you want to fly at a heck of a lot lower because you really want to get that 1/10 of a foot accuracy. And even a 1/10 of a foot in some cases isn't going to be enough, right? There will be ADA ramps, for example, and quite frankly, those are things that just can't be shot with a drone and still need to be shot on the ground. So for things where a 1/10 of a foot accuracy isn't enough, you still have to shoot it on the ground. And I'll talk a little bit in a second about what I mean by accuracy too, because accuracy by itself has different definitions to different people. Some people use the National Map Accuracy Standards, which have been around for a really long time. What we use is a more statistical-based approach called the root mean squared error, and I'll dive into that, but it's more of a standard deviation of error, or close to it. Now, one of the biggest implications of this accuracy chart, though, is the amount of ground control that you need for to get that level of accuracy. Now, minimum ground control needed is, for that first one, we say 5 targets for each, but it's 5 targets for very different levels of acreage as well, right? And again, this is optimized for the Phantom 4 Pro here, but what this says is that if you're flying at 100 foot altitude, you need 5 targets per 5 acres, so 1 ground control point per acre about. If you're flying at 400 feet, you need 1 ground control point per 10 acres. Now let's say you have had a 50-acre project site and you said, no, I want super killer accuracy. I'm going to fly it at 100 feet. Well, that would actually mean that you then need to set 50 ground control points in order to get that 1/10 of a foot accuracy. And that's a lot of actual work on the field. You're going to spend a heck of a lot of time doing that. And that's why we say fly higher when you can, because you can really end up, so let's talk about that 50-acre site, right? If you were flying that at 100 feet, then you're using 10 flight batteries at 20 minutes each, let's call it half an hour each or something just to give you time to change it out. You're looking at 5-6 hours in the field just watching a drone buzz around and do absolutely nothing. You're looking at another bunch of hours, maybe a whole day, to walk up and down the site setting 50 targets when you could have flown it in 20 minutes with only 5 targets. So that's where this whole, more data is always better. We see people burn themselves too when they're like, oh, I really wanted good accuracy, so I flew it as low as I possibly could. I spent the whole day. And then when they only set 5 targets or something like that, it's like, well, sorry, you're actually getting way worse accuracy than you would have at 400 feet because you didn't set enough control for that sort of thing. So there are trade-offs here, right? There are trade-offs between you fly higher, you cover more ground, you set fewer targets, but it's not quite as accurate. You fly lower, well, that takes more time in the field, it takes more time to set targets, it takes more time to fly, more photos, but you are going to get that better accuracy. So know the level of accuracy that you need, know what data you want out of the drone before you actually plan your mission and fly. So to sum up some of these GCP, ground control point best practices, a good rule of thumb is to set about 5 targets per battery. It's just a rule of thumb, it's not perfect for every site, but if you fly it with 1 battery on the Phantom 4, 5 targets is typically going to be enough for that sort of thing. Where you can, set them in the corners, the middle of the project, fly 1 flight line beyond each side. Let's actually look at this for a little bit too. This is a pretty standard rectangular project site here. Again, these red dots are all going to be the photos, the blue crosses are going to be the ground control points. So this is a real ideal setup. You can see that there are 5 targets. There are only about 200 photos or something there. There are 4 in all 4 corners, 1 in the middle, and it's a flight line beyond each side. So that means the drone or the control points here, there's actually a little bit of data outside of the control point. And that's because the way photogrammetry works, it actually needs to triangulate photos from different angles into a single point. And so if you have your ground control point outside of that, it can only see it from maybe 1 or 2 photos. It's not actually going to anchor the model down too well.
Why would you not fly that parallel to those roads?
You totally could. Doesn't make that much of a difference, honestly. Some of that might be wind, I don't know. I wasn't the pilot on this mission, I don't honestly know who was. Some of it might just be, it might have been that they were standing on this corner and they wanted to start it right above them and then go further away. I honestly don't know. Different people have different mission planning preferences there. The direct orientation of the flight pattern is not a major determining factor on accuracy. It's very, very minor. Typically, I'd say the wind is the biggest factor on why. I bet they did that so that they were flying perpendicular to the wind. That's my guess.
What's the etiquette involved in flying over rights of way?
So that's a pretty nuanced question, honestly, with a lot of different answers. And I'll tell you what I see. So first of all, as far as right-of-way goes and who owns the airspace, the FAA owns the airspace. Flying over right-of-way, there's no one, because they own the right-of-way, doesn't mean that they own the airspace above it. Now, where the issue arises is flying over people. There is a legal restriction on operations over people. And that's one where the rule's out there, but being fully honest, lots and lots and lots of people break it. And I'm not here to say, hey, you should go break the rules or something like that, but I'm just kind of being honest that that's one of the most commonly broken laws in drone surveying, is that people will fly drones over people or near people. I'm happy to talk after the fact a more kind of detailed interpretation of the regulations, because I can and honestly have given talks for a very long time just about the interpretation of those different regulations. But at least as far as right-of-way, the only entity in the entire United States that legally can regulate airspace is the FAA. That is it. So client's right-of-way, client's house, someone else's house that doesn't even want you flying over it. Actually, this is a good example for a project we had once of someone was suing someone else and they wanted to do a survey on a property, but they didn't have legal access to the property. So they flew the drone over it because it was an uninhabited site. It was totally legal. They flew the drone and did a hydrology survey for the court case there. And it worked out great because there is no right-of-way issues. The FAA owns the airspace. But anyway, diving back into ground control points. Yeah, 5 per battery, corners of the project, 1 flight line beyond each side, having 1 in the middle, and then visible from all angles, so having those photos on the outside actually looking in. That's how you get a really good project. So this is really an absolute ideal project. Now, not every project is a perfect rectangle like that. Some of them do some weird stuff, but let's go into some other just kind of errors and things that we see. So this is an example of insufficient ground control distribution. Not only that, it's a super weird flight pattern. It's like they flew the project site twice to kind of do crosshatch. This also suffers from overlap overkill in my mind. This is more photos and overlap than they'd actually need. But even aside from that, we see a couple of problems with the ground, or I see a couple of problems with the ground control points here. First of all, there's nothing in the middle here or even at the top, so that there's actually likely to be a lot more inaccuracy there. That might even be a couple of tenths of additional accuracy, of additional error that we're introducing into the project there. Also, if we look over here, these ones are outside of the project site. They'll still be visible by the photos. You can still kind of integrate them into the project, but we're all just adding a little bit more inaccuracy throughout. So this is an example of something where we want to see a ground control point right in the middle and expand your flight area just a little bit to make sure that it fully encompasses those ground control points, to make sure that you get good accuracy data out of it. Another example are, so this is one where it kind of depends on what the client's actually looking for. So first of all, overlap overkill. We've got our crosshatch flight pattern. Sure, it's going to get you fine data. That won't hurt you, except it'll hurt you in the time. That's where crosshatch hurts. But we have our 5 ground control points, but they're all over here. Now this would raise kind of a red flag to me that I'd want to talk to the person that flew this and say, what are you actually trying to get? Is there just like a construction site that's here that you're trying to figure out what's there, and maybe you just want some context here? Because all of the data on this site is going to be inaccurate. It's outside of those ground control points. It's going to be fine, honestly, within the box of those 5 blue crosses. The accuracy is going to be great, but outside of it, it's going to be just kind of junk. I mean, here's just another suboptimal flight pattern that we see. way too much overlap. I don't see any ground control points as well. That's someone that was probably a more novice pilot, just throwing data at the problem. Maybe if I make more flights and fly the drone more often, it can make up for no ground control, right? No, not at all. More data does not fix underlying errors in the problem. Just one last example, or another example here. We have a couple of different flights, overlap, overkill, a few ground control points that are actually outside of the project area. And then what we have here is we have this little neck with very little overlap, and then only 3 ground control points in that top right corner. That's going to be an issue because that little neck, where there's so little overlap, practically speaking splits the project up into a second project. It'll technically be connected because there's 1 or 2 photos that overlap there, but really that's a separate project. And that means that that little separate project only has 3 ground control points, which isn't enough, which means that it's going to be introducing error in there. Now there are a couple of ways that you can make up for that. First of all, yeah, it's amazing to me how often this happens. They have way too much data in the places that don't matter, and then in the place where you actually want a little bit more data, they don't actually have it. Good flight planning, good mission planning would really make up for that, that sort of error. And then insufficient overflight of GCPs at edges. This is a kind of 3D example of what one of those ground control points looks like when it's outside of the project area. So those are some of the photos there. This is where the actual ground control point looks, or is hit. You can see they're all from fairly similar angles. Just gonna add error, add inaccuracy to your overall project. So next up I want to talk about bad targets, just because target marking matters with GCPs as well. One of the many, many compounding sources of error that I've been talking about. First off, just something that's a pure white target, very difficult to discern the exact center of the target. It'll work as a target, but it might add a 10th because you can't locate, exactly which pixel in the middle is going to be the center of that target. Any sort of edge of concrete, corner of concrete is a pretty tricky target as well, especially if the photogrammetrist in the office isn't the same as the person that was in the field shooting the targets, because when you say corner of concrete, it's kind of hard to know, is it that corner or was it actually that corner up there as well? If it's not clearly marked, it just adds time, it adds confusion, and you might have to reprocess the workflow if you marked it wrong the first time. Again, it kills time, takes money, effort, kind of a pain. Chevrons, we have had, unfortunately, a lot of really bad experience with chevrons because it seems that strangely there is no consensus for how to mark a chevron. We have frequently seen people mark the tip, the inside corner, or even the center between the inside corner and the tip of chevrons. And it is shocking to me how frequently we see all of those different things from different people. And even on one project site with 2 crews, we can have them marked differently, and that just causes no end of pain there. And what I would say probably the favorite ground control point target that I've ever seen in the real world. I gotta say, if I got more ground control points like that, I'd be okay with it. I thought that was just entertaining. So those are all just suboptimal. They work, you can get them you can use something like that in a pinch, but they all add a little bit of error. A target, just something similar like that with a very, very clearly defined center point, obvious from the air, that's really what you're gonna want. Now the last thing, we've been talking about ground control. Yeah, go ahead.
What size do you recommend for targets?
Typically 12 inch by 12 inch is going to be sufficient for almost all drone operations. If you're flying at 400 feet, you can see a 12 inch target. It's a little tricky to pick it out sometimes if you're flying really high, but they're really cheap, easy to buy in bulk, easy to see. They have these on Amazon. They're just vinyl kitchen targets, so you can actually drive a nail straight through the center of them and just make them one-time use because they're so cheap. So we were talking a little bit about ground control points, but I want to say now the impact of RTK and PPK data on ground control points. Now, RTK, and I say RTK, I use that and PPK interchangeably in the sense that both real-time and post-processing workflows can get to the same level of data, so that's why I use it interchangeably. And it reduces the need for ground control and checkpoints, but control and check data is still required. Now why is that? RTK, PPK is this great new technology, right? Or, well, it's not new. It's new on unmanned aircraft, but it's not new. The problem is there's still a lot of different sources of air in this RTK, PPK workflow, and having no ground data to verify it means that you have absolutely no way to know if there ever was an error at all in your project. That might be fine for a lot of different applications. I know like mining applications I sometimes see where they aren't going to use any ground data, but that's because an error for them isn't nearly as catastrophic as delivering a project where the whole thing was off by 6 feet would be for a surveyor. That would be very, very bad. We see errors frequently just on the human side, right? Screwing up the conversions of different vertical datums when doing your post-processing. That happens all the time. So just having blind faith in RTK, in airborne RTK, PPK is something that really the technology and the workflow is not mature enough yet to have that. And most regulatory bodies or any sort of scientific body that actually verifies accuracy will agree to say, yeah, you need some sort of independent accuracy verification there. All right, so now let's talk about collecting field data. So we've gone through some of our ground control point planning, some of our mission planning, stuff like that. So what's the best way to actually collect field data? Now, honestly, the collecting field data itself is stupidly easy, right? Once you draw the box on your iPad, you go out into the field, set the drone down, you hit go, and then it just kind of buzzes for 20 minutes. It's boring. I don't need to teach you how to push go on an iPad. That's super easy. But what I probably should teach you and tell you about is how to use standard operating procedures. Because this is what makes your drone missions repeatable and reliable. And that's really what you want, especially if you have multiple crews operating. You want to make sure that no matter who flies the drone, that you're going to get the same results. And you want to make sure that when you go out and you put the drone down and hit that go button, that you've done all your work to make sure that it's actually there. So using standard operating procedures and checklists for project planning, when and where to set ground control point, your flight path setup, mission execution, all of that stuff. Having these standardized procedures are a big part of making it just that repeatable, boring workflow. I say boring is a good thing here, right? Boring in that it just does exactly what you want it to every single time. And the way to do that, as far as we're concerned, is to actually codify those operating procedures on a checklist. This is a sample of our checklist. If you drop me a business card or shoot me an email at any point today, I will send you a copy of our checklist as well. We give that away for free. Something that is comprehensive and easy to follow, creating this culture of going through your checklists, and then just scanning it, saving it to make it work. Now, I've been flying drones for about 5 years myself commercially here, and people often ask me if I still use checklists at all. The answer is yeah, every single time. And it's not because I don't know what I'm doing, it's because I've screwed up the most miserable, tiny little things out there that have cost me many, many, many hours. I think the most frustrating one for me is I had a job where it was a 3-hour drive to the job site, and I didn't have an SD memory card in my case. A tiny little piece of plastic the size of my friggin' pinky nail, and I lost about 6 hours having to drive back, grab some, and head back out to the job site. I mean, it was really in the sticks. But that's why I use checklists. It's to keep those stupid mistakes from happening. Making sure that your batteries are charged. Making sure that someone didn't steal the iPhone cable out of the case to charge their phone, and now you can't connect your autopilot to the actual drone itself. All things that we've seen before. And all things that the checklist are really, really useful at making sure that it just works. So that's why we use checklists on everything. It's not because we don't trust that the people that we're working and the people that are flying don't know what they're doing. Of course they do. They have no problem, or they'd be able to figure it all out. But the goal of a checklist is to figure it out at the most optimal time to actually solve the problem. Go through your packing checklist right before you leave the office. It takes 30 seconds, will save you hours of time at the end. Making sure that you do your last checks of looking around and safety checks before you actually fly will save an, oh my gosh, I almost hit that power line because I totally didn't even remember to look for a power line out there. So like I said, checklists, we're happy to give away ours, but they're really, really, really useful here. So what does an actual field operations workflow look like to us? What are some of the information that's on a checklist? These are some of the things that we like to go through for every single mission. First off, check the site for restrictions. Airspace restrictions, that means is it next to a major airport, minor airport, national park, something where there are airspace restrictions. Check for obstructions, how many, what sort of vegetation is gonna be there. Are there any cell phone towers, high voltage power lines, things over 100 feet we need to be aware of. Temporary flight restrictions, those are gonna be some of the legal things that the FAA puts out just to make sure that you are good to fly. I know myself, growing up in California and here in Washington as well, one of the most common and dangerous flight restrictions are for wildfires, if there are any out there. Interfering with any sort of firefighting aircraft operations is probably the biggest no-no in all of drone operations. When I say there are some rules that people break regularly, like flying over people, interfering with firefighting operations, that's a really, really bad one that no one should ever break, and if you do, you're actually going to go to jail for it or something, because they do not like you doing that. Checking the weather forecast. That's another good part of your field operations workflow. Again, you don't want to drive 3 hours to a site only to find out that it's raining there. That sucks. Drones can't fly in rain, unfortunately. Both a safety thing, but also a data thing. You get little bits of water condensation on the lens, and that just leads to bad quality data. Creating and saving your flight plan in the office, all the mission planning stuff we went through there. Packing up all of your equipment, setting up your ground equipment, GNSS base station if you have it. Brief inspection of your aircraft. Surveying your ground data, that's going to be your ground control points, your checkpoints, obstructed areas, as well as your high precision areas that you can't do from the air. High precision areas are going to be, like I said, anything that's ADA compliant needs to be shot on the ground typically. Property boundaries, usually legally, are going to need to be surveyed on the ground. Monuments, and sometimes building corners, things like that. Checking your emergency procedures, just kind of going through your basic mission loading. Running an operation is just hitting go. And then having data handling procedures too. You now just flew and all that, that little frustrating pinky nail sized piece of plastic SD card now has almost a full day's worth of work on it, making sure that you have good procedures so that doesn't get lost in somebody's pocket or left in somebody's truck so that then they're back out in the field. These are all honestly really, really simple things. None of these is a really complex issue that's hard to address. It's just making sure that you actually do address them. All right, so let's actually dive into an example, a mission planning example for one of the sites that we did with one of our clients not too long ago. And then in about 10 minutes or so, a little more than that, we can break and then come back and go into the office side of things.
Hey, Logan?
Yeah.
Do you use platforms for landing and taking off?
What do you mean by platforms? Like landing pads or something like that?
Yeah, landing pad, yeah.
Yeah, so sometimes, honestly, it depends on the project site. As far as where to take off and land, I'll give you one, I'll start by saying one thing that we never do for takeoff and landing. Never take off and land from the bed of a truck, or from the top of a truck, or from something like a park bench. People often like that because it seems easy, but no, then if you're even a foot off to the side, it's gonna come tumble down, break the drone, might hurt the truck as well, not to mention there's often magnetic interference there. So taking off and landing from the actual ground, I mean, honestly, asphalt and concrete are ideal. Low-cut grass, stomped down grass, dirt, gravel are all perfectly fine too. We only use takeoff and landing pads when it's particularly challenging, like sand or something, where you really don't want to pull any extra sand up into the motors or something along those lines. But yeah, the biggest thing is, oh, and another thing, don't ever take off and land by just catching the drone. Those things exist on YouTube, but this is a commercial operation. You guys have to hold yourself to a little bit of a higher standard than that. You might have seen, what is it? I think it was Enrique Iglesias tried to do that in like a stage on a concert once and cut up his hand real bad. So if you want to see an example of why not to do that, you can Google that at a different time. All right, so let's go into construction site project planning here. So this is an actual project that we did. This is not just a hypothetical. This was a real project that we worked through with one of our clients. 145 acres. You can see this is what the Google Earth looks like here on the right. They're going to be turning it into a big subdivision. I want to say this was somewhere in Nevada. 145 acres. We have some limitations of where you can tie everything in. They didn't have super easy access on the ground to everything. But their accuracy spec was pretty easy. They need 1 foot contours. Remember we were talking about that, 1 foot contours, That means they need better than half a foot actual root mean squared error, which means they're going to fly as high as they legally can, 400 feet above ground. Flight time for this, 145 acres. We use that kind of table. If you're flying at 400 feet, you can cover about 50 acres per battery. So all right, 3 batteries. It'll be about 45 minutes in the air, and we need 15 ground control points. So where do we set our ground control points? Or actually, let's kind of keep looking there. Boom. There's our approximately as close as we can get in the real world to evenly distributed 15 ground control points throughout that project site. Nothing special there. Trying to get them around the corners. You know, in a perfect world, I'd love to probably see one there. That might be a little harder for them to get to.
Is there a program that like tells you where to put your ground control points to evenly do that for you? You kind of have to.
Nope. Knowing where to put your ground control points is very much an art too. To go back to that one that was split by like a river or something, you'd need 5 on each side. We'll talk a little bit more about that after the break as well, but it's very much an art. And it also changes when you go into linear mission planning as well. Things like pipeline or power line corridors, those follow a totally different set of rules because it's no longer in the corners. You're then setting pairs of ground control points every 500 feet. It gets weird when there is elevation because, so this, another thing that this one actually did really well, when there are significant elevation changes, you want to do your best to have some ground control at the higher elevation, some at the lower elevation. So you can see we have some along the ridges here and here, some along the valleys, and then back up at the tops to make sure that it's all kind of evenly distributed. But it's very much an art, honestly. There's no perfect, generally agreed on consensus of here is where all of your ground control goes.
Not necessarily a requirement, but 5 batteries, or 5 targets per battery.
Yeah.
So do they have to be strategically positioned for the flight path of each battery and then placed in the lows and highs? Is that good to do for
It's a good rule. It's a good rule of thumb, and is to get it approximately that. And like it's a rule of thumb. It's not perfect, right? If you're in doubt, set a couple extra control points too. Having more control points, what you're losing is time in the field, which, like I was saying, that matters. You set a few more control points, yeah, it might take a little bit extra time. Now, what I would say is, don't say, oh, well, if 15 is good, then 50 is better, right? There's very much a diminishing marginal return here. The difference between 10 control points and 15 is going to be a lot better. Difference between 15 and 20 might be more reliable, but probably not better accuracy. Difference between 20 ground and 50 ground control points, nothing. You just wasted a bunch of time.
I have a question. For a project like this, how would you set all these control points? Or what would your methodology be for setting this control?
You mean actually in the field?
Yes.
I would go out, so it depends on the client with this. I forget exactly what they were using. I think they just had a standard GPS base and rover. They set up one base station and they drove around in their truck and they hammered in one of those control point tiles at each one of those locations, just with a nail in the middle, occupied it for a couple of minutes, and then at the end they have 15 points of extremely high accuracy. And they just drove around in the truck for
right.
the beginning of the day.
So for a project where you need that 1/10 accuracy, what's your procedure for setting control on something like that?
As in, to get that 1/10 of a foot accuracy?
Yes.
Probably total station.
Okay.
Yeah.
You
It's
need,
never,
what,
the
3
drone.
times better?
What was that?
So you need, what, roughly 3 times better?
Yeah, 2 to 3 times better is probably a good rule of thumb. You're never going to get better accuracy from the drone than the ground equipment that you're using too, right? Which is something that I see a lot of software vendors unfortunately say too. They'll use like a Trimble Catalyst, one of those like, you know, really, like it's a cool technology, but they'll say that they got 3/100ths of a foot accuracy. It's like, no, the Trimble Catalyst can't get 3/100ths of a foot actual accuracy. I mean, no GPS system can get 3/100ths of a foot.
No, they're all 10th. If it's RTK, it's a 10th by 2.5 tenths.
Exactly. So this is going to be better than that. With this one, I think they did a couple minutes occupation on each point. If you are doing that 1/10 of a foot, in fact, we've seen ones that tested out to the best project we ever saw. It was flown at 100 foot. It was a project that was all hardscape. All of the control on the ground and all the checkpoints on the ground were shot with a total station. And we saw a error from the drone to the total station of 7/100ths, which was, I thought that was killer. Like almost so good it was hard to believe. But that only exists because you shoot all the control and your checkpoints with a total station on the ground.
And I had a question about that too. So the new national mapping or for the aeronautical standard at a 1 to 50 or 1 to 60, is something like 6/100ths of a foot for your total RMS. So if you're gonna back this down, you're gonna run a 1:20 scale map. To meet those certifications and standards, what kind of RMS do you actually need?
We'll talk, I have a whole section after the break on the ASPRS positional accuracy standards and actually the guides for measuring and reporting accuracy. So we'll get to that.
Right.
But finishing up on this, so here are 15 ground control points, approximately evenly distributed. Here's what the flight plan looks like. That's where they actually launched from the middle. That red circle is about 1,500 feet from the launch point. So it's the approximate visual line of sight of the pilot, so they could actually do all of the mission from a single vantage point without needing to take off in other areas. Single back and forth flight pattern. And once we go through all of the processing, ta-da, this is actually what you get. Notice there's a heck of a lot more stuff going on in the ground than there is here. That's because it's built up, because that's how the real world works. So this is what the final output kind of looks like. That you want to actually get your major and minor contours, your break lines, your topographic mapping data, and a lot of the kind of rich data. And that's what we're going to get when we come back from the break. We're going to go through the actual office workflow. And that office workflow is going to include, obviously, our photogrammetry, which is taking those photos, actually stitching them into that 3D model, drafting line work, going from that 3D model into points and polylines, and going from points and polylines into a final survey. So with that, we can break for now, and I will see you all in half an hour. Okay. Let's actually start things off. I know we got a few people that'll probably trickle on in the next couple of minutes, but I actually have a lot of content to cover over the next remaining hour and a half, so I promise I will do my best to keep you awake, even though it still is data processing, so hope you had some caffeine. So we obviously went through the whole field workflow beforehand, and now I'm going to go through a complete office workflow for how to actually get the most valuable deliverables out of your data in the least amount of time and money and investment possible. So what a sample workflow looks like this for us. There are 3 major steps. There's the photogrammetry step, going from just your photos and ground control points to your rich 3D model. The line work step, rich 3D model to actual points, polylines, and then finishing it in CAD, merging your field shots and that sort of thing. But there actually, for a good workflow, there are a couple of other hidden steps involved as well. There should be quality assurance at every single step of the way. That you're actually looking for different errors, you have a human in the loop, and don't just throw data at a computer and pray that everything's going to come out fine, because errors happen. That is no fault of yours. That is not even a sign that anything went wrong. That is just the way the real world works. It is messy and errors happen. So having QA, QC steps through every step of the process is part of a really reliable workflow. In fact, it might sound strange, but it'll save you time in the long run. By having QA steps in the intermediate steps, you will catch errors earlier on in the process. And if you were to catch a minor photogrammetry error all the way here at the end, just when you're doing some final check, and these 2 steps took you 2 days, then you just lost 2 days because you didn't actually do your QA in time. So a good workflow should have QA built into every step of the process. Well, let's go back to that drone surveying journey that I talked about a little bit. However, it typically starts with these just basic photos and videos and wants to get higher and higher to get to that integrated workflow. Each one of those 3 steps is typically a different kind of chunk of that journey. Photogrammetry is right at the beginning, getting your photos and videos and getting more accuracy out of them. Line work drafting is getting through your 3D data and clean data. How do you manage that just big, huge data file that you get out of these? And then your CAD finishing is kind of putting it all together, creating that smooth, integrated, reliable, repeatable workflow. So a little more detail. What do we mean by each of these steps? Photogrammetry, the art and science of combining 2D photos into 3D data. What the software outputs it, the inputs are going to be photos and ground control points. The outputs are going to be a point cloud, an ortho-rectified photo, and a digital surface model typically. There are a handful of other file formats as well, but these are far and away the most common and far and away the most useful of them. Then you need to reduce that rich model, which will include everything from every blade of grass, every tree, every car, person, and artifact out there, you need to reduce it into useful data. Your photogrammetry outputs are typically too big for CAD. Anyone that's tried to input a 10 gigabyte point cloud directly into Civil 3D knows that it's just not going to be a good time. So reducing it to CAD compatibility, actually getting it to clean data that is functional and useful in CAD as well. And then you need to finish it in CAD. Merge your field shots, create a surface, add your culture and annotation, add your right-of-ways, add your utilities, blah, blah, blah. Seal it and create your finished drone survey, which should be indistinguishable from a conventional survey. So just kind of going through those steps a little bit more, kind of in a workflow. Start with photos and ground control plus any RTK PPK data into the photogrammetry step. That creates your ortho photo, surface model, point cloud, which then goes into the line work drafting step, which creates your points, polylines, typically in a DXF format, so not too rich. Go into CAD finishing, and you're typically going to get it into DWG, adding your culture, contours, and surface, and that's what goes into your final deliverable. Through all this, just to go back a little bit to this workflow here, sorry, that one. There are a whole bunch of different softwares you can use. We have our preferences as well, but you are not locked by any means into one fixed software workflow. And in fact, some of them are different tools for the job. I know Civil 3D is obviously the most common. Carlson is in the show here as well, and lots of our clients use Carlson. It works great. Pix4D is probably the market leader for photogrammetry. Agisoft Photoscan's out there as well. Line work drafting is a little bit more messy because there are a heck of a lot more options out there as well. But each one of them is capable of doing these sorts of steps. So that's kind of what the whole process looks like. I'm going to just blast through the other couple of slides on RTK and PPK processing real quick, just because this one's a little bit technical. We have more of this information on our website if you actually are really interested in the RTK process and PPK processing side of things. We already talked about this a little bit, the RTK versus non-RTK enabled, lower accuracy, more field time. RTK and PPK are going to be more expensive hardware, but set fewer ground control points. We're big proponents of the PPK workflow because it gives more redundancy, it doesn't require 4G cell service, it doesn't require active radio links. It's a much more robust and resilient workflow than an actual field real-time kinematic workflow out there. So what that looks like, the PPK workflow, collect data in the field, gather all your correction data, run PPK algorithms, adjusting your GPS data for time and gimbal offsets, and then actually integrating it into your photogrammetry. Again, I know I'm going to go through these really quick. If you want to know more about specifically how to post-process your airborne PPK data, check out our website. So you get your photos and checkpoints. Why do you still need actual checkpoints? Why do you still need ground data? You need to verify your accuracy, calculate the amount of error that's still in the project. There's always error in everything. There's error in GPS, there's error in the real world, there's error in how well the bubble on your tripod actually works, and exposing blunders to make sure that if you do screw something up, that you catch it before you actually deliver it to a client. So yes, RTK, PPK, you definitely still need checkpoints, always, always, always. Gathering the data, rover data in this case is the drone. Base station data, you have multiple options, just like with GPS in the field. Set up your own base station, use a network correction data service, use a CORS base station for your corrections as well. It is subject to all of the exact same implications as ground-based GPS. The longer your baseline distance, the more error you're going to introduce. The longer your occupying times, the better accuracy you're going to get. Whether you occupy over a known point or not, and on and on and on, and that sort of thing. And then, of course, your broadcast ephemeris data, too. We typically like using NASA, because, again, when you're post-processing everything, you can wait the extra 12 hours to get the highest quality data for all of this stuff. Run your PPK correction algorithms. You can use anything that you want. Trimble Business Center is the most common that I'm familiar with. RTK Post is one up here that is an open source alternative that we like, because we just like open source stuff. And then the other thing is adjusting outputs for your offsets. When the drone's flying, the drone and the camera has a gimbal on it, and it's moving around with the wind and navigation and whatnot. And what that means is that the actual antenna, even once you've run your PPK algorithms, you're actually getting the location of the drone's antenna. And you don't care about the location of the drone's antenna. What you care about is the location of the camera. And also, you're getting the location of the antenna at satellite time, which is typically either 1 second or 0.2 second intervals, but the camera will be taking photos not always at exactly those 0.2 second intervals. So sometimes you need to interpolate between the two to get precise data. So being able to adjust for those offsets, there's software out there. We have some custom software at Aerotas as well that does that, to adjust it from 1 second intervals to at the time of the photo, and from the location of the antenna to the location of the image sensor. This really was the big barrier for the past couple of years of getting airborne RTK and PPK to work properly. And it still is a challenge. It still is the most complicated part of the workflow, but it's finally crossed a threshold where it's a lot easier to manage. And lastly, once you get that, you have to integrate it into photogrammetry, getting the right horizontal datum, coordinate system, getting your vertical datum right. Typically all the PPK stuff and even RTK stuff is going to default put out into WGS84 or something, but you'll need to localize to your exact project, use NAV83, or even if you're on a pure local or arbitrary coordinate system as well, that's capable with the right workflow as well. Take all that metadata, add it into your photos, and then you're ready for the photogrammetry step. So that's your brief thing with RTK, PPK. It is a newer technology. Definitely feel free to come talk to me about it afterwards if you want to know more about what we can do with it. So, diving right into photogrammetry, which is going to be the most common step, what people are most familiar with, especially now that drone surveying's been around for a couple of years, people at least know a lot more about what photogrammetry is than softwares like Pix4D. But I'll go over the basics again. Creating 3D data from 2D photos. And the output of this step is that rich 3D model. It is the art and science of making measurements from photographs. A little bit of history, it has been around for a very, very long time. In fact, the earliest topographic mapping that I was able to find using photogrammetry was actually World War I observation balloons, that they'd send up 2 different observation balloons and take photos and use that to get contours of the enemy battlefield. So this was happening as early as 1914. The basic principles of photogrammetry really haven't changed much since then. The math, the science, it's all about angles and triangles and whatnot is exactly the same as it's always been. The application is a little different because instead of an accuracy of maybe 100 feet and putting things in a stereo plotter, we now use digital imagery and computers to create hundreds of millions of matches in a matter of minutes. But the same technology has just been around forever. But there are some problems with it. Rich 3D models are not perfect. If you look here, the contours on the raw dirt, not too bad. Maybe you put a smoothing algorithm on them to make them look nice. But of course there are contours around all of the cars and tractors and whatnot, and that's totally useless. Not to mention the fact that just these contours, and especially the full resolution orthophoto and elevation model, is going to be multiple gigabytes in size and is going to blow up CAD. But that is what the outputs, the raw outputs are from the photogrammetry stage is. Now there are multiple options for processing photogrammetry. The first is something that's an automated service, an automated cloud service. Common leaders in this segment are things like Drone Deploy, 3D Robotics, their product is called SiteScan, and Propeller's another one. These are the ones where they're cloud-based, you drag your photos in, you upload them, they have fully automated machines that just crank it out and then send you an output together. They are far and away the fastest and simplest, and honestly they're probably the cheapest out there as well. The key drawback is they have the lowest accuracy and the most number of errors. There is no human in the loop. That makes them very fast and cheap, but it also makes them low accuracy. If there are any errors, they won't catch them. They just keep processing it and push it out that way. That said, they very much have their place. In fact, they're really good for job monitoring, anything where you need quick, low accuracy maps. If you just need an image, if you don't care at all about accuracy, that's probably the way to go. It's going to be way faster than doing it yourself. And for a lot of, I know, like GIS applications, people use these services because they don't care about accuracy. But we work with surveyors, and surveyors care about accuracy, so these are typically not going to work. So the next option is in-house. That's things like Pix4D and Agisoft PhotoScan. They're very flexible. It gives you a huge amount of control over the workflow. But as we'll go through, they're difficult to use and they can be expensive. Pix4D license, I think it's the lifetime license is just shy of $9,000. There's some sales sometimes. We typically recommend using that in-house, mostly for sensitive data or unusual projects. We've seen a handful of clients that work in places where you don't have good internet connection, or because of some sort of disclosure agreement, your data is so sensitive that you can't actually give it to a third-party provider. And that's why people use these things in-house. But you do have a lot of control over the process. And then there's a service like Aerotas. We actually do photogrammetry as well. We have trained photogrammetrists in-house that have the benefits of scale with really powerful computers and training, so that we have a human in the loop the whole way. But the drawback of it is that it's a little bit slower turnaround typically, because you do need to have a human, or because an automated or a specialized service like us will have a human in the loop, a photogrammetrist that's looking through it. That means slower turnaround time, a little bit more expensive than the automated service, but typically can be more reliable than in-house, just because we see a lot more projects. So we think that's good for pretty high accuracy mapping. But I know probably a lot of you guys are here because you're using photogrammetry yourself and you want to know what are some of the best practices to do that. So let's go into it. What are the best settings for Pix4D, right? Sorry, there are no best settings. Photogrammetry is not just a thing where you can throw stuff into a black box and actually get good data out. Instead, using Pix4D correctly, Pix4D is being the market leader in photogrammetry. It's not about the settings, it's about the workflow. Every project will have different settings. In order to get the proper accuracy out of a project, you need to be able to adjust for, heck, the slight distortion of the camera lens will actually change with temperature and humidity. So having a set of fixed settings doesn't work on every project. The way that different elevations will impact a lot of these things mean that you need different settings for different projects. So having a standardized workflow, integrating checkpoints into it, constantly checking for errors throughout the process, adjusting your settings based on the site, and this last one at the bottom, getting trained on photogrammetry, is probably the most important step there and the best way to actually learn about this. Photogrammetry, as much as a lot of these software, so at Aerotas we use Pix4D, that's our primary photogrammetry engine, and we are proud and open users of the software. But I do sometimes say that they do a little bit of a disservice by pretending that photogrammetry is just like a, hey, buy our software and all of your problems are solved forever. But it does take a little bit of work, and you should have some good understanding of photogrammetry. Because honestly, fixing a problem in a photogrammetry workflow, it takes 3 main steps. The first is that you actually have to realize that there's a problem. These are the most dangerous problems out there, and one that we see, it's less common among surveyors, but what we see it as are, we get a lot of interest from people that aren't surveyors. And they'll send us photos and say, hey, I hear there's money in surveying, right? I'm not a surveyor and I have no idea what it's doing, but like I hear there's money in it. And they'll produce a map on one of those automated services like Drone Deploy, and they'll say, how do I turn this into a survey? It's like, you don't even know how much you're missing here. You don't realize that how bad your accuracy is, because these services will say, look, hey, we gave you a green checkbox. Accuracy is good. And they don't realize that, no, that's terrible. You don't even know what you're measuring here. So step 1 is realizing that you have a problem, but there are more problems than just that. So once you even find out that you have a problem, you need to figure out what caused that problem. And once you figure out what caused it, you can either fix it or you can avoid it next time. So those are kind of the 3 steps. And we'll actually go through some of those examples in the real world. Because quite frankly, the real world is messy. Annoying things happen. There are errors that aren't your fault. There are errors that are going to be caused by vegetation in certain parts of the project that can't be stitched together, and that causes just kind of weird blocking in the photos. GCPs shot across multiple days can be shot inconsistently sometimes. We've seen things where multiple survey crews on a single project site will set up and tie into slightly different points, and that causes no end of errors out there. The camera can be physically knocked out of calibration as well. Or GCP targets can be moved. Once you set them, and then you go fly and you realize that someone came and kicked the target by a foot after you had already set it. And that causes errors too. Not your fault. Doesn't even mean that you're doing something wrong, but it's something that you've got to keep an eye on to make sure that when that error happens, that you catch it and that you don't push out bad data. So there are 3 key ways to identify errors that we believe in. The first is analyzing the quality report. We'll kind of go through a Pix4D quality report here in a second. The second one is to actually use check shots. If you're not using check shots for any of your aerial survey data, start. You should use check shots. You should never trust blindly any sort of third-party service provider. And third is to gain experience with photogrammetry, and I'll talk about the next steps. I wish I were a good enough teacher that you could walk out of this class and be a certified photogrammetrist, but that is not the way that science works. Also, I'm not a very good teacher at all. So let's go into the quality report. So this, for people that are using Pix4D, some of these might look pretty familiar. So this box up here at the top right is on every single project where it has a couple of things that say, hey, here's our overall analysis of some of the projects that you've done. And this is where I think Pix4D does the biggest disservice to its customers. 5 green check boxes, you're good, hooray. And look, it actually says here, you have 8 ground control points, that's good. 450-ish photos, that seems the right number, with an RMS error of 0.003 of a foot. You're such a good surveyor. You got 0.003 of a foot accuracy. Congratulations. Yeah, it's a joke, but they actually put those numbers up and give you a good green check mark, but it's actually calculating the number against itself, kind of. So that 0.003 is obviously meaningless. There's no way that that's a real number. The only way to measure your actual accuracy is going to be by actually checking independent checkpoints in the field. And if you were to do that, I guarantee you would see probably right around a 10th. And honestly, if you saw better than a 10th, it's probably because you got lucky on the statistical side of things. It's not actually better than a 1/10 of a foot accuracy. And it certainly isn't that 0.003 of a foot accuracy.
Is that 3,000 is just how well it can force fit its data into your 8 ground control points?
Correct.
Oh.
It's how well it fits the model into the 8 ground control points themselves. So it's why it's kind of a meaningless number. Now, of course, if it's red, and if it says that there's a problem, then that's a pretty good indication that there is an actual problem. But just because it's all green doesn't mean that everything is good and everything is accurate. So let's say, now this is exactly the same project. This is a map of the matches between photos on this exact same project. And what we notice here is, look, everything kind of looks good. This is from the top down, each one of these yellow dots is a photo. Lots of good matches. But then over here we have a whole big gap. And I remember from looking at this project in the full model, all of the ground control points were also over here. Which means that if I was doing this project, everything's green. Here are our actual ground control points themselves. Yep, they still say we have really, really good accuracy. But I can tell you right now, any data that's right in this area is going to be total junk. And I don't know what it is. It might be a lake that's in there. It might be vegetation. It might be the top of a hill that got so high that there wasn't sufficient overlap and they weren't able to create a good model there. But this is like a perfect example of a project where if you throw it through to a blind processing system, it'll come out and say that everything looks good. And if you're not trained to look for an error like this and say, oh, whoa, be careful. If you need data over here, this is looking like it's going to be pretty good. But data over here is definitely going to be junk. Being able to identify an error like that is pretty important. So the quality report is a good place to look, but you need to look a lot deeper than just that those first couple of green boxes and making sure that they check out. So we were talking about checkpoints. Checkpoints are the best way to independently measure this. Make sure that you withhold them from the photogrammetry process. So they should be measured independently. They should not be used in photogrammetry. In fact, if you actually integrate them into the photogrammetric model, they are no longer a checkpoint. They are actually part of the model, and you are fitting it to the model. So it doesn't actually independently verify anything. And they should be approximately evenly distributed. These are just some good ideas, but I mean, really, that's how you make sure that this data works. And that's the best way to at least identify errors and know that you have an error. And then the next step, obviously, of figuring out what caused it and avoiding it the next time. And the last thing is to actually get trained on photogrammetry. We are big proponents of what is called the ASPRS. If you are actually interested in going down the photogrammetry route yourself, we recommend becoming a member of the American Society for Photogrammetry and Remote Sensing. Like I said, photogrammetry has been around for a long time. They were founded in 1934. They have all kinds of educational resources and certification programs. That's my certificate as a certified mapping scientist in UAS. They have a drone-specific certification that they just launched about a year and a half ago, so that's an option as well. But like I said, that's part of a long journey in actually becoming a certified photogrammetrist or a certified mapping scientist to actually learn a lot of the science behind photogrammetry. Or of course, you could hire us because we have lots of people with these certifications that know what they're doing. Now going beyond that, the next thing we talked about saving time and money a lot today too. So that means if you are doing photogrammetry yourself, it's important to actually manage your processing time as well. As we talked about, a lot of this is decided in the mission planning process, right? The number of photos you take, the flight altitude, the overlap, the flight pattern, whether it's single lawnmower or crosshatch or blah, blah, blah. To reiterate, there is such a thing as too much data, overlap, overkill, flying too low, crosshatch patterns, and that is because processing time is nonlinear. You double the photos, you typically get about 4 times the processing time. People want to throw money at the problem is very frequently the case. So if you're either the person that's working in the office or the person that controls the purse, I would say either way, a good workflow is worth so much more than a good computer. Creating good operating procedures is way better than trying to spend $15,000 on some crazy custom monster fluid-cooled flames painted on the side computer or something like that. You can spend all the money in the world for a 10-20% bump in processing time, or 10-20% decrease in processing time, when often a clean workflow by itself will lead to 60 to 70% reductions in processing time. Workflow is worth so much more than hardware. And that is both field workflow and office workflow. And also there are some other steps of that workflow. Staging your processing, running the first steps multiple times, catching those errors sooner so that you don't have to run a 24-hour process multiple times over, that you catch those errors in the first half an hour of processing, heck, in the first 15 minutes of processing, so you don't have to reiterate all of these things. So let's go through a couple more sample problems with things that we see in photogrammetry. The first one that's common is projects processing into multiple blocks. We've referenced this a couple of times, that you need about your 5 ground control points for every project or every flight battery, but sometimes there are things that actually get in the way and cause projects to split up. So this is one example of a project split into multiple blocks. I believe it was because of dense vegetation kind of going through here. And this is one of those things that you need to be aware of when they happen, but it's not always the kiss of death. It depends on what data you're looking for. If they had all of their ground control points set over here, and this was the only area that they really cared about, then they're probably fine. If they had only 1 or 2 ground control points over on this block, then that's a big problem. If it all processed together, maybe it would have been enough ground control. But since it's processed separately, maybe you need a little bit more. So being able to identify what can split a project into multiple chunks will definitely help you keep your projects accurate. Oh, yeah.
Can you add points after the fact?
You can sometimes. If all you have is a grassy field, it's really tough, but you can add visual ID points as checkpoints. Say there was a manhole cover or something, you can go shoot that after the fact and add that in. You obviously can't go and nail a target into the ground after the fact because it's not going to show up in photos. Don't laugh at that, people have tried it. We work with some people that have a very tenuous grasp of surveying in general and don't know how they're licensed.
So then would you recommend shooting all your checkpoints the same day as you shoot your, you do your flying and do your targets?
Typically.
So that generally you'll have those just in case points?
That actually, yeah, that's a very common workflow that we see and a pretty good one as well. People will often shoot multiple types of checkpoints as well. Sometimes they'll shoot marked points as checkpoints so that they have X, Y, and Z coordinates. Sometimes they'll just do topo points just to validate the vertical if they're doing it for topo because that's all they care about. If you do have them marked as X, Y, Z points, they're great because if there is an error found, you can substitute in an additional ground control point if needed.
Or throw in extra targets and
Yeah.
just not use them?
Exactly.
And then just call them checkpoints?
Exactly, yeah.
Do you or clients that you process for do a lot of like volume stuff where you compare one surface to another?
Mm-hmm. Yep. That's going to be typically a different post-processing workflow. For a lot of volume stuff, oftentimes it is more efficient to not calculate volumes in CAD or something like that. So using a cloud-based service, something like Propeller, is going to make a lot of sense for those mining applications and pure volumetric calculations. If you do need a CAD surface, then that's where this workflow and going through something that we do makes a lot more sense.
But to do the comparison, you gotta have part of the surface that stays the same the whole time.
Yeah.
Imagine.
Yeah. And some of this is your data processing workflow too, right? I mean, honestly, what we do everything from mines and raw earth topos all the way up to full-blown ALTA surveys as well. And a lot of the type of stuff that we do is really overkill when all you need to do is tell me how many cubic yards of dirt do I have in that pile. Our workflow is probably overkill for that sort of thing. But we can talk back. Volumetrics are a little bit different just because you don't need a ton of detail oftentimes.
Right, but if you were doing it in one of the previous steps, you know, like, I don't even remember the names of it, but program, but you gotta have something to control both horizontal and
Yeah.
vertical, so something's gotta stay the
Yeah,
same
something, so
time.
you absolutely still need control.
Yeah.
Especially when you're doing comparisons, because if you have 5 foot of air, then a stockpile that then moves 5
Right.
feet, you're gonna have huge amounts of cut and fill when it doesn't actually exist, because
Right.
you just moved the pile
Yeah.
5 feet when it didn't actually move. Yeah. So as part of the photogrammetry stage as well, there are a lot of artifacts. Now this is an extreme example where asphalt was causing a lot of these just kind of big spikes there. But this is another one where I'd say this looks bad, but is actually not necessarily a problem. Because artifacts will happen on smooth surfaces. Sand, asphalt, and water especially. Anything that's an almost uniform, perfect color can't be matched appropriately, so it creates these weird artifacts. Now, the reason I say this isn't an issue is because, this is a pretty bad example, but a good line work drafter, when they look at something like this, they can actually pick out the points on this model that are good. Things like oil slicks or tire marks or even the paint striping on a road is a good target for photogrammetry and will be matched properly. And then the asphalt in the middle will create all these weird spikes and dips. So this is something that happens in that rich 3D model of photogrammetry, but can be fixed in post-processing, fixed in the line work drafting stage. But it's worth being aware of, because when you are doing something like volumetrics too, sometimes if it's a particularly smooth kind of sand stockpile, it'll create these artifacts as well. And when the quality report and all of the statistical data, even your checkpoints, might come out perfectly and it'll still have artifacts. So it's something that a trained eye can pick up on, that like, yep, there are these artifacts, how do we deal with them? There's some ways to reduce them in the photogrammetry settings as well, just by bumping up the number of matches that are required to create a confirmed point. But mostly we like to fix these in post-processing, in steps after photogrammetry. It's a more efficient workflow that way.
Do these spike both directions, up and
Yes.
down? No.
Yeah,
That sucks.
it does suck. Because it also causes a problem for automated things like low-pass filters, where people say, hey, just drop a point on the lowest, within every couple of meter region. But yes, they do cause little valleys as well. And then any of those auto-pass filters will just drop points right in the low points. Part of why you need a human in the loop still, to be able to just kind of pick these things up. More real-world targets as well, real-world problems. This one was an extraordinarily frustrating project because it was actually a demo we were doing, trying to sell to a really high-end client. This photo was taken at exactly 12 noon. There's our ground control point. There's the nice city landscaping truck. And 2 minutes later, on the second pass, our ground control point is in the bed of their truck because they determined it was trash and they didn't like having us littering their project site. So of course we were able to pick this one up eventually as we were trying to market and everything disappeared. So what's even the solution to things like this? The error is pretty obvious here, and the cause was pretty obvious as well, that someone came and cleaned our ground control point. But this is one where we can look at it and say, okay, well, we could either go back and we could shoot a point after the fact, we could actually find like, okay, maybe we'll go and shoot one of these visible points right here that we can use in both photos. Or in this case, we actually said, you know what, it makes more sense because for this project, let's just ignore that corner of the project from photogrammetry. We'll use it for imagery, and we'll send a crew back out and they can do the basic topo stuff on that the next day. And then it's only a tiny little amount. But it's something that, like with all of this stuff, you need to identify the error and then decide what to do. Do you fix it? Do you add your visual ID point? Or does it make more sense to go through a different route to still get good data out of it? And there are honestly a lot of other errors that are even difficult to realize that they happen. The GCP distribution can cause error. I know someone asked earlier about, is there a program that tells you perfect GCP distribution? No, and there is no such thing as perfect ground control point distribution. It's really hard to know. It's a lot more of an art right now than science. There are GPS errors in the measurement of ground control points. You don't occupy the point long enough. If you're under power lines, if there's GPS multipathing, all of that happens here as well. Random blurry or unfocused photos, that'll happen. And subtle camera calibration inconsistencies. The camera lens can just slightly shift as it moves. In fact, there's one thing that, just an example of stuff that you can't control for at all, is just imagine that you're flying a job site, you take off, everything works, and it's a nice hot summer day, and a nice big fat juicy bug gets sucked into the propeller. And that big fat juicy bug left a nice heavy amount of big fat juicy bug guts on the propeller that throws that propeller ever so slightly out of balance. And that introduces ever so slightly an amount of vibration into that drone that isn't properly balanced. And now it's vibrating. And that vibration means that the camera is actually vibrating a little bit too, that can't perfectly match it. And by the time that drone comes back and lands, most of those guts are going to be flung off, and you're going to have those tiny, imperceptible, typically 1 pixel or less of vibration that was going to happen throughout the entire flight and introduce error, and you have no way of ever knowing about it. Did you do something wrong as a pilot? No, of course not. But does that mean that you should trust exactly everything and exactly the specs? No, this is why you need to have things like checkpoints in there. The real world is messy. It is always going to be messy. You can't eliminate errors like that. And there are a few more that are just more common. Changing in lighting consistency, really sunny at the beginning of a project, then a cloud comes in front of the sun. It makes the project ever so slightly less accurate. It also may make half of the project look bright on one side, half look dark. It's not the end of the world at all. In fact, it depends on the client whether or not you want to have a perfectly evenly lit ortho photo for the deliverable. But I mean, ultimately, the key thing to know about this is that error compounds as well. Each tiny little source of error might only add, from a theoretical standpoint, 1/100 of a foot of error, but they all multiply with one another. That little bug example probably by itself wouldn't do more than 1/100 of a foot of error in a whole project. But if you have a couple of those little things, from ground control points to your mission plan being slightly off to your ground control points being one of those white blocks that you couldn't perfectly identify the center, those all add up, and that's where most people are not getting to the top of that kind of pyramid there, is that they don't have tightness throughout every step of the process. So if I could wrap up the photogrammetry stage of this with a statement, it's that, honestly, photogrammetry is hard. We find errors in probably half of our client projects that get submitted to us. And an error, again, is not saying that you screwed up mission planning. Errors just happen when everything works perfectly right. And most of those errors, when we catch them, we can fix them in the processing stage as well. We can fix them by throwing out ground control points, adding in a ground control point as necessary, changing the camera calibration, adding manual tie points to fix multiple blocked photos, and on and on and on. But these errors actually happen very regularly, and you need to have a human in the loop if you're going to be using this for survey applications, to be able to catch those errors, to fix them, and go from there. And ultimately, I mean, there's a reason that photogrammetrists are called scientists, because this is a science. There's a lot of skill, there's a lot of math, there's a lot of experience involved in picking these things up. So, before I move on, does anyone have any questions about photogrammetry or want to talk about those steps, experiences that they've had with Pix4D or similar, any problems like that.
What about on your Pick 4D, classification where, the example you gave was pretty flat and no obstructions or anything like that. If you had to go through and do a classification on buildings or trees or whatever.
Oh, point cloud classification?
Yeah, Pick 4D do that.
Technically, yes, but it's the wrong tool for the job. So that's what we would call part of the kind of line work drafting phase, where you're taking that rich 3D model, adding a lot more information to it by classifying those different point clouds. Pix4D as a program is capable of that, and it is a miserable workflow. Very slow, very painful. You don't want to do that to yourself, even though it is technologically capable of it.
How long does it take to get a photogrammetry cert?
6 years. So it's like a lot of surveying that, or a lot of surveying licensure, that you need to have a level of experience as well as pass a test. The entry level ASPRS certifications, it's called a Certified Mapping Technologist, requires 3 years of work in photogrammetry and related fields in surveying. The higher tier, which is a scientist level, requires 6 years, plus you have to pass an examination with the ASPRS to actually get your certification. So yeah, it actually takes a lot of work to be able to get your cert. That said, it's a route that we definitely suggest. In fact, a lot of the people I work with back at our company are only on the technologist level and working towards it. It's also a little bit of a catch-22 because drone photogrammetry hasn't been around for 6 years, so it's a little bit limited to people that at least have some experience in traditional photogrammetry. But as surveyors, a lot of your experience will actually count towards that as well, even if it's not directly in photogrammetry.
You also have to have 4 references that actually will certify your work.
Yes.
Having worked for them.
Yes, that is correct. Character references and professional references that say you've worked with them and that you're not just blowing smoke. Really, the protection for that are people that think that because it's to keep out people that think that because they spent $9,000 on Pix4D, they now know everything that there is to know about photogrammetry, and that's just not the case. It's a wonderful software. We are proud users of it. It is, I believe personally that Pix4D is the best in class of what it does, but it definitely takes experience to know exactly what you're doing. Just like any CAD program, right? You spend a bunch of money on a Civil 3D license, that does not make you a surveyor or an engineer. It's experience that makes you a surveyor and an engineer. But you also have to know what how to use the programs on top of that. So let's talk next about measuring and reporting accuracy. And with this, I'm going to lean on ASPRS a little bit more because they have published what are called the ASPRS Positional Accuracy Standards for Digital Geospatial Data. This is what we were talking about a little bit earlier, which is how to actually measure and report accuracy correctly. Now, if you are a masochist for highly detailed technology papers, this is where you want to go. It's about 30 pages of peer-reviewed scientific literature and formulas for everything you need to know on how to actually verify accuracy. I'm going to cover some of the very high-level things that it takes to actually follow these standards, but they are really, really useful. And in fact, to us that work in this sort of field every day, this is like our accuracy Bible. When we report accuracy, this is what we use to report accuracy. When we measure accuracy, when I say 1/10 of a foot, what I am actually saying is an accuracy class of 1/10 of a foot, or some of this is in centimeters, whatever that winds up being in centimeters, an accuracy class of that, which implies a vertical root mean squared error of blah, 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 blah. And it goes on and on and on. Now, it's used to measure accuracy, and we like it because it's sensor agnostic too. It doesn't matter if you're using a GoPro that you duct tape to a pigeon, or if you're using a $100,000 photogrammetry rig, or satellite data, or even LiDAR data is all perfectly acceptable for using the ASPRS positional accuracy standards. But notably, it does not specify best practices. It doesn't tell you how to get good accuracy. All it tells you is how to measure your accuracy. So if you measure your accuracy and it says you're at 3/10, it's really not going to tell you how you can get from 3/10 to 1/10 of a foot. That's what I'm here for. But this is how you can say that it's 3/10, and how you can also certify that it is up to 3/10 as well. So going back to what we were talking, accuracy spec determines ground control. We saw this chart before, 100 foot, different amount of acres that you can cover, how many targets you need, and the expected accuracy. So when we talk about it, again, that 1/10 of a foot vertical, we're talking of a root mean squared error here. So root mean squared error is, like I said, it's very close to a standard deviation of the difference between between the checkpoint and what the drone model has. It does specifically use those checkpoints, not ground control points, and an independent source of higher accuracy is what it says. Typically about 2 to 3 times more accurate than what you're actually seeing. Which means that if you want to truly measure and verify up to 1/10 of a foot, then really you ought to be using something that can measure on the ground accurately to, about 3 or 4 or 5 hundredths of a foot on the ground. And it also, to actually get to the reportable accuracy class here, if you do need to certify according to ASPRS positional accuracy standards, you need a minimum of 20 checkpoints. And that's to get rid of the fact that you might just measure 2 or 3 and say, they look good, that's good enough. That actually might be good enough in some projects because not every project needs to be certified to these accuracy standards. In fact, getting that certification is itself expensive in terms of field time because you have to set these additional checkpoints. So setting those 20 checkpoints to hit that number, you might need it in some projects, but not in every one. We had a project I remember once that we did. The end client was the Army Corps of Engineers, and we were working with an intermediate surveyor, and they're like, this absolutely has to be right. They're like, we need this certified. It's like, all right. It wasn't a huge project. It was like 20 acres, and they're like, we need you to set at least 20 checkpoints. And they said, great, we're going to set 30. Because then the Army Corps wound up hiring them and then hiring another surveyor as well to check them in the first case. And sure enough, we did it. Our independent accuracy came out to something like 14 hundredths of a foot vertical, which was totally in spec with what they were looking for. I think they were looking for quarter foot accuracy there. But that's how you actually report it. And then the reporting language for that, and this is pulled just raw directly from those ASPRS positional accuracy standards. And there are 2 different levels at which you can report it. There is, let's see, one that is tested to meet, and the other that is produced to meet. So the top one, this one was tested to meet the accuracy standards for an accuracy class of XYZ centimeters, and it was actually found to be blah, blah, blah. And then additional information, what does that mean the confidence interval is? So it's scientific language to show that there are actually different levels of reporting accuracy. They have these accuracy classes, which are kind of different buckets that they throw it into. There's the actual root mean squared error, and then that equates to a different number, which is your 95% confidence interval as well. And the 2 different things between tested to meet and produced to meet, tested to meet means that you did throw those 20 checkpoints on, you actually tested it, you verified it, and you said, hey, I am putting my seal on here as a photogrammetrist or something like that, that this has actually been tested, that we verified it, we put our work in and independently verified the level of accuracy. And then of course the other one, this was produced to meet ASPR's positional accuracy standards, means that we've done this before, we know what we're doing, we didn't test this individual project, but we followed all of the same procedures, so we have good reason to believe that it meets this, but the implication of the produced to meet language is that you didn't actually set all of those checkpoints. And this is up to you and your client about what level of accuracy that you really need for the project. So go back to why we actually do this, why we use ASPRS as our accuracy Bible. And that's because, honestly, we see way too many different definitions of accuracy, way too many measurements of accuracy, from the really just kind of hold your finger in the air type thing, all the way to national map accuracy standards, which really are great and were great for a long time, but are kind of outdated by modern statistical measures now. How many checkpoints do you need? I set 5, is that good enough? Oh, kind of, maybe. This really standardizes it, and so it gives a level of confidence throughout the industry, so that client, surveyor, and everyone along the step everyone throughout that value chain can be on the same page about what level of accuracy you need for a project, what that actually means in the real world, and on from there.
Do you have to be a certified photogrametist to put this statement on a map?
I don't actually believe so.
Okay.
It would depend on each individual state's language about what you want to put on a map, or what you like put on a sealed plat or something. But I don't believe you need to be a certified photogrammetrist in order to state this.
Okay.
But you are obviously attesting that you did the work according to these standards when you say that. So
Right.
if you lie, it doesn't really matter if you're certified or not.
Right.
So you're saying your 20 checkpoints, these actually have to appear in the image, or something after you get processed, I'll run out and get my XYZ and check it against XYZ of the product?
It can be either. It doesn't have to be set and marked beforehand. The real key to it is it just has to be independent. It cannot be involved in order to be a checkpoint under the positional accuracy standards, it cannot be involved in the processing of the data itself.
So when you say set, I don't have to set, I can just go out there and maybe shoot certain.
Yeah, those you can use visual ID points more often as well. Again, sometimes we see if all you want to do is measure the vertical accuracy, this is reporting for a horizontal accuracy class. There's a set of almost exactly the same language for vertical. Then you can just do topo points too, right? You don't even need to have a fixed XY location. You're just measuring the vertical accuracy. Vertical also it gets a little more complicated because there are two different types of vertical accuracy in the standards. There's vegetated accuracy and then there's non-vegetated accuracy, and they're measured in slightly different ways because vegetated areas are subject to more systemic error. For example, if you're running photogrammetry on a grass lawn, then absolutely every point is going to appear about 2 to 3/10 of a foot high because it's measuring the top of the grass. And all of a sudden, that measure of root mean squared error isn't very useful because it's no longer that nice, smooth bell curve distribution of errors on either side. It's a systemic error that's all on one side. So vegetated has its own different reporting standard that's based on confidence interval, as opposed to hardscape vertical, which is based on the root mean squared error up here.
What level of accuracy can you get the RTK bird when you test it with all 20 points?
When we've tested it, we've gotten like a level of accuracy that I almost don't believe sometimes.
Right.
Yeah, I don't even know. I'm kind of surprised that we've been getting such good accuracy, but we've been getting between 1 and 2/10 of a foot.
Really?
Yeah.
And is that using post-processed?
Yeah,
with
PPK.
multiple bases or just one?
Typically just with one base,
Oh.
but with one base over a known location.
Oh, okay.
So one base on a fixed position, or one base getting like an Opus solution on that base or
Alright.
something like that.
Okay.
So it's actually surprised us that we've been getting that good
Yeah.
of accuracy. Yeah, kind of unusual. All right. Any other questions about photogrammetry and accuracy there? I should emphasize this accuracy thing is really important. To me, it's probably one of the more important things that we're talking about here, just because knowing accuracy there's so much misinformation out there. There's so much misinformation about what accuracy from drone surveys actually means. There's relative accuracy, there's absolute accuracy, whether you're measuring something directly to NAT 83 or you're using local coordinate system. Like I said, there are people out there that'll shoot GPS that only has an accuracy itself of maybe a couple of tenths of a foot, and then claim that their drone survey is accurate down to 3/1000ths of a foot again. That stuff is out there. And unfortunately, it's a lot of the hardware manufacturers and the software developers out there that are pushing these things to say, like, look, our software is so magical, 3/100ths of a foot accuracy on everything. Our hardware is so good, all you need to do is write us a $60,000 check and you'll get magical, amazing accuracy. And typically that's because they're just not measuring accuracy right. They're measuring it, but in a very different way that doesn't stand up to like scientific rigor or any sort of actual academic scrutiny that these standards would. So using these standards, if you really, really, really want to step up your game and get proven accuracy, you can get it. You can get a 1/10 to 2/10 of a foot regularly, reliably, repeatably. You can't get 3/100ths. That's not going to happen. But a 1/10 to 2/10, absolutely. if you get your workflow tight, if you know your sources of error, if you have your QA, QC in the right place, this is all absolutely doable. All right, so the next step is, in all of this is going to be line work drafting. So, what is line work drafting? Line work drafting is taking that super, super rich 3D model, whether it's a point cloud or a DEM orthophoto combo, and reducing it to a CAD-friendly surface. That is because photogrammetry outputs are too big for CAD. The orthophoto is too big for CAD, the elevation model is too big for CAD, and the point cloud is going to be way too big for CAD. And so you reduce it to that CAD compatibility. So this is an example of one of our live projects as well, what that actually looks like to us. We have the imagery back there. This one's using what we would call a 2.5D model. So it uses the raw surface model. You can see it has all of the bushes. But it's not a point cloud, so it doesn't actually go underneath eaves or anything. It has topo points, it has polylines. If you actually look, we can even get 4 curb lines. When you fly at 100 feet, you actually can get accurate enough data that you get all 4 curb lines when you are drafting a curb. But that, you've got your edge of concrete, edge of pavement, you've got your utility access panels all marked in there. All of that is what we mean by doing line work drafting.
Now, was all this done manually?
Yes, with an asterisk. There are tools that assist with this. If you actually look, most of that point grid, they're all perfectly evenly spaced. That was all dropped the way that one of the many workflows that we use is take a huge swath of the project, drop an automated point grid that does it every 20 feet, and then you go through and delete the ones that are erroneous, find areas that need additional information, and go from there. Same thing with brake lines, going through drawing brake lines. There are some automated brake line tools out there. They'll run some brake lines, and then they'll run weirdly off on top of a bush and draw a brake line on the bush. So you stop that, delete it, bring it back, and keep it going from there. So the definition of what's manual and what's not starts to become a little hazy. Because is this purely automated? Oh, no, absolutely not. Human in the loop every single step of the way. But is it a human sitting there actually clicking on absolutely every single point? No, there's software out there that helps. So it's about finding a workflow that's that right balance. And I'll go through some of the different options in just one second about what different tools you can use.
Just one more question on that. So if it's, what you say, 5 acres of battery, roughly.
Yep.
On a residential, you're shooting houses, doing a site to say at 100 foot, how long is the processing? Or how long are you sitting in front of the computer clicking?
Really depends on what you're getting. If it's just topo, it might be a couple of hours. If you want to get in 4 curb lines for every curb, that can actually take a while. If all utility access panels are in and you have 1,000 utility panels that you need to shoot to, it takes a lot of time. A good rule of thumb is that it takes, this is just kind of ballparking it, whatever time it would take to shoot it in the field, maybe about 20 to 30% of that is what it's going to take in the office. So it's a heck of a lot faster, but the more time it's going to take in the field, the more time it'll probably take in the office. Because every stuff, honestly, you're replicating the same exact workflow. When we're doing a grid here in the field, you'd probably be walking, taking a topo point every 10, 20, 30 feet. When you're doing a curb line, you'd be walking that curb line and shooting it and then offsetting it. A couple of different options. So it's way, way faster in the office, but it's still a very similar workflow there. So why is this whole step necessary? Like I said, files are too big, too much data you don't need. You don't need contours in the tops of cars, you don't need the tops of trees, and not enough data that you do need, or ugly data in contours. And go back to this slide as well, that there are all of these ugly contours. And also there's the human element of things as well that gets it really messy. And part of why I don't like a lot of these automated solutions is, say you need to do a survey of a project site, and there's a big debris pile in the middle of the project. Do you include that in your survey? Well, it really depends on what the survey is, right? If it's for a junk moving company and they want to know how much debris there is for them to move, then that's the single most important thing for you to actually survey. If you know that a dump truck's coming tomorrow to move all of that and they want to know where the dirt is so that they can level it for a project site, then you certainly want to exclude that. It really totally depends. And that's one of those things why all of this automated stuff gets really messy, and you need a human in the loop that has some context for the project of what data you're actually pulling out of it. So all of these automated contours, they face a lot of challenges in addition to just being messy and ugly and having too much data. But overall, there are, as with photogrammetry, there are honestly a lot of different options for drafting, for extracting this data for line work drafting. These are your kind of operational drafting options, automated, in-house, and drafting firm. And then I'll go into the actual kind of technical methods that can apply to each of these as well. Next, automated software analysis. This is kind of like the drone deploy of these software analyses too. To me, I believe they're often very much oversold with their capabilities. Give us a point cloud, we'll classify everything perfectly, you never need to do work again. Yeah, no, it doesn't actually work like that in the real world. They are very cheap at scale. Typically, they're extremely expensive softwares, and they're very fast too. Extremely fast relative to any sort of manual drafting sort of thing. Like I said, these are those automated point cloud classification tools, or things like low pass filters that'll go through and find the lowest points in between vegetation and drop a surface based off of that. It's great, but really they're inaccurate, and a huge amount of QA/QC is required. They so regularly, even the best of them, will draw break lines and contours around cars, around vegetation, around bushes, around the tops of houses, conveyor belts and whatnot. They require so much QA/QC that typically I don't find them to be useful for surveying applications. To go back to what you were saying, for things like mines and quarries, they actually probably are a lot closer to being good enough in those sorts of applications. Part of that is just because there's so much less noise in those. They're all so often stripped of any sort of vegetation. All you need to do is get rid of trucks and conveyor belts. But anyway, that's your automated software analysis. It promises a lot, and you know what? The future is going towards more and more automation, which is great. But my personal opinion, not quite there yet for the majority of surveying stuff. Next is in-house drafting, high accuracy, reliable known product. That means you're taking this, you're importing it into your own software, and you're extracting all of your own points. Downside of that, it's typically very expensive labor. If you are a registered land surveyor, your billing rate is going to be a heck of a lot higher than a kid that's 1 year out of college with his first job and in surveying and just needs to extract some data points as he's starting out his career. It is very time consuming, and typically you don't have the specialization for this. Or you hire a drafting firm, shameless plug like Aerotas, that's affordable at any scale because we can do it per project. We can have $20,000, $30,000 of software licenses, and you don't have to buy all those software licenses with excess capacity and specialization. That we have certified photogrammetrists that actually do the photogrammetry step. We have line work drafters and CAD technicians that do the line work drafting step, and we have engineers that actually do the CAD finishing steps as well. Downside of that is, of course, you don't have control over the process. You are outsourcing it. It's not universally the best solution out there, but we like to think we're pretty darn good at it. But you do have options out there. We're not the only option in the world. In addition to your kind of operational drafting options, you also have different methods of line work drafting as well. These are kind of the technological methods for how do you actually extract data. The first is drafting on individual photos. There's a company I don't know if you've heard of called Datamate that offers a software that does this, and it's actually possible in Pix4D as well, where you're actually picking out individual points on the individual photos themselves, and then it gets integrated into the photogrammetry model to extract those points into 3D points. It's very, very, very accurate, but also very, 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 very time consuming. Because for every point you typically need to mark it or draft it a couple of times in order to actually get a proper match to extract it. It could be useful for some of the most tricky points that are maybe covered under building eaves, like building corners, that can't be seen from every angle, but is absolutely horrendously impractical at scale. Next up is drafting directly onto the ortho photo. This is a really easy way because there are a lot of softwares that are capable of doing this, from GIS softwares to CAD softwares, things like that, where you're just drafting directly on that 2D ortho photo itself. Has the benefit of being quite easy. It can be a pretty fast workflow as well, with the downside, of course, being that it's only 2D data. Next up is point cloud drafting, working directly in the point cloud. That's going to be manually classifying your points, working with cross sections to create curve lines. This is among the higher accuracy options out there, but also among the most time-consuming options out there. Has the benefit of you can look underneath things. It's a full 3D, rich model, but again, very, very, very time consuming as well. And then there's the 2.5D DSM ortho drafting, where you're working in a 2.5 dimensional environment and you're drafting points and polylines on the entire model. So what's the best method of this between all four of these? And the answer is there really is no universally best method. Each one of these tools is applicable for different scenarios. Drafting on individual photos, most time consuming, but most accurate. Point cloud drafting, next most accurate, but also next most time consuming. 2.5D DSM, you're getting a lot more time savings there. You're starting to see a lot of efficiencies and losing a little bit of accuracy. Orthophoto as well, you're losing all of your 3D data, but you are getting a lot more in terms of time and efficiency. So it really depends on what you're trying to get and what the project site is for picking the right tool for the job. Honestly, for an advanced workflow, I would recommend having all of these tools available and potentially using multiple of them at once. If you do want to pick out building corners on individual photos, great. And then if you want to use the point cloud for things under building eaves, sure. And then for all of your topo data, use that 2.5D DSM and ortho photo, and maybe you're drawing paint striping for the parking lot on the ortho photo because that's the quickest way to draw your paint striping. Different options out there, picking the right tool for the job, using the right software. And I'll go in a second as well, some of the different softwares that are out there and our recommendations for those as well. So I'll pause there for a second. Any questions on the different methods of line work drafting that I'm talking about here? Do these make sense? I know I don't have too many pictures with this one. All right, cool. Now these are good methods of line work drafting. They all have their trade-offs, but there are some that we would consider to be absolute, unambiguously bad methods of line work drafting. The first is importing an ortho photo directly into Civil 3D. As we talked about, that is typically a bad idea because Civil 3D does not handle very large files particularly well. So what people will often do is they'll downsample the file, they'll lose resolution, they'll compress it, and then they'll throw it into Civil 3D and draft on it. And then you're introducing more error, you're drafting on a lower resolution file, you're just adding, you did all of this work to get your original model up to high accuracy, and then you're throwing it away. The same thing is what I call dumb decimation of a point cloud. Point clouds are big, point clouds are messy, they're hard to work with. A lot of people will say, oh, well, if it's too big, why don't you just cut out 90% of the points and then you can draft on that? Well, now you're throwing away 90% of your data as well. That, especially if you're doing things like curb lines or where there's anything sharp, you're ruining it. Like you're just throwing it all away. So these to me are just unambiguously bad methods of line work drafting. Yes, you can technically do these, but anyone that says like, oh yeah, just delete 90% of your points, then you're fine, that'll make it easy to use. Don't trust that. You're throwing away all the hard work that you did to get that accuracy. You want to keep that, you want to draft, all of this stuff should be done drafting on full resolution models in a software that is designed to use those full resolution models. In fact, that's part of why a lot of the drafting directly on the ortho photo is going to be done in GIS softwares, ArcGIS, QGIS, things like that, is because they're softwares that are really well designed and optimized for very, very, very large files and photos without compromising on resolution. So what are some of the line work drafting softwares out there? Well, here they are. Here are a bunch of them. As with the other line work drafting steps, they all have their benefits. TopoDot is, I know, one of the leading point cloud processing softwares out there. We have lots of clients that use mobile LiDAR will love TopoDot, but it's crazy expensive and also very time consuming. Virtual Surveyors is a really good 2.5D model, as is Global Mapper. Global Mapper can also do point clouds. Autodesk Revit, 3D Reshaper, I know all have varying capabilities of 2.5D or full 3D point cloud processing stuff. And then ArcGIS, again, we like QGIS just as our company likes a lot of open source stuff as well. Is all really good for drafting directly onto the ortho photo. Now, the next thing is, I mean, ultimately this is a time-consuming step, right? This is manual, this does require human in the loop. These are some of the just estimates that we have for about how many man-hours it will take to do drafting. I know we were talking about this earlier, it does depend on the project. This is an estimate, but it also shows you that, you know, a 14-acre ALTA survey might take 7 man-hours of work. 140-acre topo, 10 times the size, but only twice the amount of time, because obviously you're just doing topo. It saves a whole bunch of time. 2.5-mile corridor, maybe 15 man-hours there. Single family home, it says 2 man-hours. Honestly, I've seen it done in less than that, in half an hour or an hour or so to get everything that you need on a 10,000-foot lot or something like that. But really, this is a time-consuming step. Every year, new softwares come out that run the whole range, that promise to do absolutely everything with a single click and make your life easy. They almost never live up to that promise, but usually they help. It would not surprise me at all if I came back next year and I could show this same chart and just cut 10 or 20% off of each one of those numbers, because the automated tools are getting better. The ones that are drawing the curb lines do it just a little bit more reliably so that there's less manual fudging involved with it. The vegetation filters that say, hey, that looks like something that's green, let's call it vegetation and pull something out.
Was these timelines what you'd consider accurate for like your company to do?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, this is about what it would take us to do.
Somebody who's highly experienced and has every tool.
And has every tool,
right,
including a lot of hardware to throw at it as well. We haven't talked a lot about that. I'll talk about some of the costs of these things in a second when you actually put it all together. Because to keep it all efficient at scale, honestly, yeah, there's a lot of processing power involved here. But first, I'll go into what we consider the last step from a technical standpoint, which is CAD finishing. So CAD finishing is how do you go from, okay, great, you've got points and polylines in your 3D data, into, again, this, an actual sealed, finished survey. So first off is merging your field shots and your drone data. We've talked about this before, I'll reiterate it because it's really important. The drone cannot do everything. The drone is a tool in a toolbox. It is great for topo, it is great for bare earth, it is not great for boundaries, building corners, monuments, ADA compliant shots, or obscured areas. Especially around here, you guys have more vegetation than, you know, someone working in Nevada, for example. So being able to know as part of your workflow, yep, if it's under dense tree cover and you really need that to be accurate and have a lot of rich, dense data, you're gonna have to shoot that on the ground as well. But the drone data is typically good for topo points, brake lines, paint striping, edge of pavement, and curbs occasionally. The reason I say occasionally, it really depends on what level of accuracy you're looking for the curbs. I was showing that one project, where is it there? We actually had enough resolution and detail to get 4 curb lines. You have to fly pretty low to get that. Typically that's around that 100-foot altitude above ground level, where you are getting really, really reliable data in order to accurately model the gutter. Gutter's particularly hard. However, if you're flying at 200 or 300 or 400 feet, you really often can get the edge of pavement and the back of curb done pretty well. If those 2 curb lines are enough for your project, for at least the topo on it, then great, go for it that way. If you actually need all 4 curb lines, maybe you shoot them on the ground or maybe you fly lower. Really depends on the project and the accuracy requirements of the client themselves. We've seen all different types as part of this CAD finishing too. I mean, one thing that you can obviously do is draft just the back of curb and then offset it to get a top of curb. And in almost all scenarios, that is going to be good enough. But it depends on the client, and you guys are gonna know your own clients way, way better than I ever will. So that's merging your field shots and your drone data together. So you put those all together in CAD. Obviously, this has to be done in CAD at this point. You create your surface in CAD, just, you know, smart points, contours, major and minor contours. Apply your own custom layering standards as well. Typically, when you get something directly out of one of those 2.5D models, you might have it in your own layer standards, you might not, so applying your own layers is important. And then some additional things, like improving visibility and usability. Any of these drafting standards will typically, if you mark utility access panels, it will just be a single point, an XYZ point. So adding on your various symbols, symbology, so that this is actually useful and usable to the end client, so that trees look like trees. And then the last step there is going to be adding in CAD-friendly imagery. So this is imagery that is designed specifically to work in CAD. And you remember I was kind of knocking on Civil 3D a little bit earlier, that you can't import a full resolution ortho photo into Civil 3D. And that's true, it makes it blow up most of the time. But you do want to have imagery in your final map because that gives you, or your client, context over everything that's there. It allows you to print it all out, it allows everything to be properly geo-referenced. So having a good compression algorithm that can actually take that full resolution, multi-gigabyte ortho photo, compress it into something that is CAD friendly, use it to back up all of your drawings, and it's optimized, like I said, for giving context to it and printing. So that's an additional step that we consider part of the CAD finishing side of things, so that you do actually get the imagery. Remember I was talking at the beginning, saving time and money is important, but you want better deliverables too, right? And that means getting this timely, up-to-date, accurate, geo-referenced imagery in there. So if you don't have the ability to kind of compress it and actually get it to work in Civil 3D, then that's something that you really ought to do. With, of course, the goal being, again, I've done this, said this multiple times, a final survey should look exactly the same whether it was made conventionally or with a drone. I know we talked about sealing it, that you can put your ASPRS, this was tested to meet, designed to meet accuracy standards. A lot of that hasn't been picked up by state boards about how to report the accuracy of drone data. And quite frankly, some of our clients, the way that they've picked up is that they won't even say that any of the data was delivered with a drone. To talk on the business side a little bit, I know a lot of people say, well, yeah, how do I sell drone data to my client? And I would actually argue, don't. Sell topo data to your client.
I think the new topo standards within the state of Washington require you to notify everyone how the data was collected.
Oh, great. You guys are going to be experts on that. Definitely not me.
Yeah.
That's recent.
That's
very recent. Yeah.
Cool. Are they already in effect, or are they going into effect soon? Okay, great. So for you guys at least, make sure to double check that if you get your topo data, that you then do notify your clients. But especially as it was first written, a handful of people didn't. It was just topo data. And even when you do notify them that it is flown by drone, what I would argue is don't try and sell the drone as a special service. The drone is a tool to make your life easier. Honestly, it's as this technology has matured, the cachet, the cool factor of drones has totally gone away. So don't try and sell drone services. Let the kid that got a drone for his Christmas present sell drone services for, $5 on some app or something, and let you guys do what you're good at, which is high precision surveying. And you use this as a tool to gather and deliver that data in the way that is most cost effective to you and gets the best deliverables to your client. So that's the technical standards. That's like the technical workflow of how to get from photos and ground control points and GNS data all the way to this final deliverable. But to put everything together, to tie it all up and put it in a nice, neat little bow, you really need to create an efficient workflow around all of this, right? It would take a long time to do what I did the first time as you're just kind of setting things out. And like I said before, if your drone program isn't saving you time and money, then it isn't working. If it takes you 2 weeks to go through all the steps that I just laid out, and you could have shot that whole project on the ground in a day, well, that's a pretty dumb use of time, isn't it? So how do we get this actually to put it all together into an efficient workflow? Well, first off is create efficiency in every step. You've probably heard me throughout as I've been dropping these things like, yeah, this is probably the best, like the most accurate way to do it, but this will save you a whole bunch of time. And this is what will make it more reliable. And this is going to be good enough and accurate enough for what you need, and creating all of those balances. And creating that efficiency at every single step is what takes this from a science project to a lean machine that's just running and making good money for you guys. So planning the project, having that experience, that only takes a couple of minutes. Setting your targets so that you know where to set them. Collecting data so that you get it the first time, every time, without needing to revisit the field. Running your photogrammetry so that you don't need to reprocess that and take 4 or 5 days for every project. And then getting your most highly paid and most intelligent engineer to draft the line work is probably not a great use of time. And then finishing it in CAD. I mean, there's so many different ways to actually look at all of this and make sure that you get efficiency through every step of the process. One of the easiest ways to do that, we said this before with flight planning, with standard operating procedures. Having your standard operating procedures at every step of the way as well. So from mission planning, knowing exactly what those standards are, I said things like 75-75 overlap, single back and forth flight pattern, and nadir only. You have that standardized, and you get away from things where people are playing with it, like, ooh, I'm gonna fly this project site 4 different times to actually see the difference between all of them. Well, then you're actually surveying a site 4 times, and that takes a lot of time and money and effort. Having your SOPs to actually make it reliable, repeatable, so that you know what goes into the process and what comes out at the end is always going to be the same. And I like to say, know your desired outputs too. One of the biggest time killers we see are people that are like, we're just going to fly the drone and see what we get out of it. Can you imagine sending a crew out to a job site and be like, let's just see what they come back with? We're not going to tell them what to shoot. Just give them some tools. Give them a truck with $150,000 worth of GPS and total station, and hopefully we'll get a survey back from it at the end. Maybe. Yes, you laugh, but we see this every day, and it drives me nuts, because this happens. People are like, yeah, we're going to fly the drone. We'll see what we can get out of it. And every single time, they will spend weeks wrestling with the data and wind up no further along because they had no end goal. They didn't know what they were trying to get out of it. And if you don't know what you're trying to get out of it, then you'll never get it. You have no end, there's no finish line. So always know what you're trying to get. And to go back to what we were saying, like, I can go back to, what step was it? This. Know what you're getting from the drone, and use the drone to get it. And then know what you're getting in the field, and use your field tools to get it as well. Because ultimately, the drone is just a tool. It is one of many, many tools that you guys have in your truck. It is not the right tool for every job. It is not the only tool for the vast majority of jobs. You use multiple tools for exactly the right thing. GPS is great on many projects. Total stations are great for others. Metal detectors are very useful as well and cannot replace, and a GPS will not replace a metal detector. And the drone should be part of that kit as well. So knowing when to use it, knowing the type of data that you're collecting. Another thing just as part of this whole workflow is just being aware that you need to plan for data storage too. There is a lot of data involved in this. 10 acres of site at 100 foot above ground. That'll typically be about 5 gigabytes of raw photos. If you want to save all of the interim processing steps, 15 gigabytes of photogrammetry data, another couple of gigabytes, blah, blah, blah. I say data transfer here at $10 a gigabyte. If you're new to this, don't try to upload everything over a Wi-Fi or over a cell phone hotspot or something. You will run up a very, very big bill. I had this was early on in the drone world at least, I think it was 2015. I had a large company that wanted a quote to do sites and upload everything via cell service, and the bill wound up being like $50,000 of cell data bills, which was like more than what our services would have cost by a lot. And they were like, well, that's ridiculous. I'm like, yeah, use a Wi-Fi actually use a Wi-Fi connection. Don't upload it. Just be aware of some of those implications in there, and also aware of how to store it using things like Box, Google Drive, local networks. We use AWS for all of or Amazon Web Services for all of our storage and all of our uploading stuff, just because you are dealing with a lot more data than a typical survey project will use. So I'll dive into a couple examples here. This one is this is a real client who I'm going to leave completely nameless to protect the innocent. This client had a boss that really wanted to be on the high cutting edge of things and gave him a nearly unlimited budget to create the most kick-ass drone program in the world. So this is pretty much the full setup that he had. He had a micro drones, really high quality drone with a great camera. I think just the camera was probably 10 or 15 grand. The total drone setup was probably 60 or 70 grand. Spent like $20,000 on a custom custom-built processing server, $10,000 on their Pix4D license, another 10 grand on their TopoDot license, Trimble Business Center to pull everything out of the point cloud, no limit of budget. And they came to us and wanted to help us process their data too, and we did it. The data was truly some of the most high-quality data that I have ever seen. That drone, that camera, unbelievable, the quality of the data. But the problem was, they spent like $100,000, something like that up front, and it was taking them 50 to 60 man-hours per project. Didn't matter the size of the project, that was the bare minimum. Even if it was a 1-acre project, it was taking them 50 to 60 man-hours to prep the drone, run the mission planning, set up the custom base station, run through all of the steps, actually get the flight, process it, integrate it. It was this insanely over-the-top complicated workflow. And when it was done, it was the best quality drone data I've ever seen. And the program got canceled. Because at the end of the day, with all of this money invested, the boss was looking at that and saying, why the hell would I do that when I could just send a crew out and shoot it in a couple of hours? This is ridiculous. That's a dumb, stupid workflow. And yet it was the best data I've ever seen. And this is a trap that a lot of people fall into. They want the best quality data, the best computer, the best this, that, everything. And they don't even think about how to make it a sustainable project. So a counterexample is, all right, so what does a good workflow look like? So day one, you go out, you fly the site, takes about, let's say it's a couple of acres, takes 15 minutes or less to fly it. You shoot your ground control, you survey a couple of things on the ground, you do all your boundary work on the ground, and you upload it to us that same day. Day two, we would have processed all the photogrammetry, sent it into our heavy photogrammetry queue overnight. The next morning, the photogrammetry is already going to be complete, and our line work drafting team will begin drafting on it right away in the morning. And we're going to, by the end of day two, we'll deliver our DWG files, the actual survey, a couple $100 or something for a project maybe. And then day three, you take that from us, verify the data in the office, merge in your field data, sign, seal, deliver it to a client. If you're working on a couple $1,000s worth of hardware, maybe 10 man-hours per project, maybe less. Probably includes our man-hours as well. This is not $100,000 worth of hardware, and strictly speaking, it's not going to be as amazing as the data that you can get from $100 grand worth of software. But this is what makes a sustainable, reliable, repeatable, good workflow that will make you money on every project. So I'll walk through just kind of one last quick example here. Here's a job site that, let's say we were doing an ALTA survey of this office park here. Happens to be the office park where our office is located. So, 13 acres, it's got building corners, a couple non-participants, oh well. But we need really good accuracy. Accuracy spec was 1/10 of a foot vertical, looking for a 7/100 or so horizontal. So that means we're flying it low. 100 foot above ground, 40 minutes flight time, 3 batteries. We'll need to set our 15 ground control point targets as usual. As before, building corners, or corners of the property, some in the middle, that sort of thing is where our ground control points will go. There's our flight plan. It's a small site, so all of it from a single area. And ta-da, here's our then ortho photo, raw ortho photo. You can see some other interesting artifacts here. It was sunny when this side of the project was shot, and it was not sunny when this side of the project was, or when parts of it were shot. Those different colorations will happen. That's just, actually I think I screwed that up. The one with the shadows is where it was sunny. Sorry. But yeah, you can see that those colorations actually change with weather. But for this, the data is actually perfectly high quality. And in fact, I bet our photogrammetrist noticed that and double checked in that step to make sure that there weren't any accidental gaps or shifts on that boundary from where it was sunny to cloudy.
What level of altas are you guys doing? I'm thinking of some of that, I mean, if you're just doing like alta boundaries and you're just showing the main buildings, that's about it. But things that we need to get, like signage, you wouldn't be able to see what's on a sign, or if we've got utility marks painted, you wouldn't be able to see all the different utilities that are called out, or like handicap signs that are underneath cars and things that we need to show. So what?
You're right. So this is going to be things like this one I think was used primarily for topo and parking stalls and all of the paint striping. that was on the ground as well as visible utilities, but there absolutely was still a crew on the ground with this. I mean, you have to walk it legally, you have to walk the boundaries, and you do have to locate all of the other signage. Yeah, it's not gonna get signage. And this goes into that mixed workflow thing, right? A drone cannot do an ALTA survey by itself. It can make an ALTA survey process faster. And I'll give you, so one example in this project site, there are 10 buildings here. Let's assume they're all perfect rectangles, even though they're not quite. 10 buildings, that means there are about 40 building corners. There also happen to be about 450 or so parking stalls. Does each parking stall require the same level of time and accuracy as attention as each building corner? No, not even close. And yet if you're shooting it on the ground, you're spending just as much time shooting that building corner as you are shooting that parking stall. Wouldn't it make a lot more sense to spend your time in the field shooting just those 40 building corners and pull all those paint stripes, just pull them straight out of the model? And if they're off by a 10, even 2/10 horizontal for a paint stripe, whatever, as long as the count's right, that's really the biggest thing. As long as it's pretty good. So that's what a lot of this stuff really is when you actually draw all of this. This is the data that came from the drone. You're right, it does not have the signage and the list of signage on there, but it does have a lot of that paint stripe information. There it is, just kind of without the ortho photo. So what does this look like? Field data collection, ground control, 2.5 hours, drone setup and flight, 1 hour, plus all of your other field shots. I think they still spend a couple of hours with that. In-office data processing, in-house would take 8, maybe a few more man hours, or we would have charged right around $1,000 for all the data processing on a site like this. Integrate it and finish your survey. And really that's what a good workflow really ought to look like. And again, it's a mixed workflow. It's not an all-in-one. It's not going to do a full ALTA by itself. So really I'll use that to segue into the most shameless plug, since you've sat with me that long. We do offer all of these services. We call it Aerotas line work. It's professionally drafted survey grade files from your drone data. You send us the photos and ground control points, and we actually create a CAD package for you. The points, the polylines in layers that actually make sense with a CAD surface and contours baked in. That includes all of our photogrammetrists doing the photogrammetry, all of our CAD drafters doing the drafting, all of that, which we're all in the US. We don't outsource any of that overseas either. And that gives you lightweight, easy to manage files, 1/10 of a foot accuracy or better on most projects, tons of time savings, all of that. You can learn more at aerotas.com/Lyman. And with that, I'll thank you for taking the time to be with me and open it up for questions. But first, if you do want, please drop a card off with me or shoot an email to me, logan@aerotas.com. I would be more than happy to send you the slides from this presentation, actually a video of this presentation as well, our field checklists, and our a copy of the ASPRS positional accuracy standards if you want to use that. I'd be more than happy to send that along. So with that, thank you very much, and I'll open it up for questions.